If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 51, Harry Potter, Chapter 50, Effects I. The nonverbal Evacorpus lifted the first student before he had the time to fully understand what was going on. A friend of his appeared from another alcove while I twirled on myself and my wrist moved with a corkscrew pattern. Expelliarmus. The red bolt of the spell streaked across the corridor and shone upon the surprised face of my target just before impacting against his midsection. Caught on the back foot, the remaining two students floundered for a reaction, and for a second, I left the here and now behind. I remembered the thrumming exaltation that rang through me when I lit a golden flame to attract the werewolves in the French countryside, and the deep need for the shield I had transfigured out of wood while my heart hammered in my chest. Powered by my need and underlying understanding of the magic involved, my shield charm took shape in a bubble around me. It stood like a translucent outline, separating me from the rest of the corridor. Ineffective spells impacted against my shield without managing to even make it waver. I felt each of them almost like sparks of unexpected tastes on my tongue, like minute needles impacting my skin without causing any damage. Behind my protection, I ignored a plethora of jinxes and standard dueling charms while I rose my wand once again. 3 silent Evacorpus and a stunning charm later, I was left facing the last of this quartet of idiots, who had long since fallen into a frenzied panic in witnessing a defense that allowed me complete freedom of movement. In my mind, the sturdiness of the shield didn't waver. The principle behind it had been used against werewolves. It was the same push without name that I had used to tear one of those off my back. How could a mere student hope to overwhelm it? I stunned the first student I had upended and the one I had disarmed without bothering focusing on their features. I had recognized the little leader of this group. Smarter than the other, he was the last one standing, not that it was going to help him any. I was so beyond any regular student that it wasn't even funny. How could they, who limited themselves to waving wands and shouting nonsense, prevail upon a half-giant that constantly challenged any preconception, who had delved deeper and deeper into the underlying, implicit principles of magic? My Expelliarmus impacted the hastily erected shield of my remaining opponent just as I stabbed forward with my wand in the final movement of the stunning charm. The red bolt of magic shattered the defense of my opponent in time for me to slip the always useful nonverbal Evacorpus. I left the bubble-shaped shield charm behind as I approached the only conscious attacker that remained, and I was about to stun him too, excitement bubbling in my veins, when I stopped. I didn't even try to get out of this with words. I grimaced inwardly as I observed Thescaredkid that flailed aimlessly in the hold of my Levacorpus, and I knelt to retrieve the wands of the idiots that thought coming after me was a good idea. Hadn't I proved in my first year that I should be left alone? Slytherin students were the most likely to have a bone to pick with me. Being so massively different from them, it was only to be expected that my uncaring attitude would engineer resentment. 1 Slytherin, 1 Gryffindor, 2 Hufflepuffs. It'd be a good example of inter-house collaboration if not for the context. Why would you think that attacking me could end in any way but this? In class, I never bothered hiding my skill in the practical execution of spells. Besides, performing them to the best of my ability more often than not prevented me from having to deal with the more intense homework that the professor felt would help those struggling with achieving success. Given that I was still pissed, and partly at myself, I stared in the eyes of the upside-down kid in front of me. I had almost religiously practiced occlumency exercises since I awoke in Hagrid's body, to the point that clearing my mind was the first step for any magic that I tried to execute without incantation or wand movement. But this particular branch of magic was simply one side of the coin. It boiled down to awareness of the self, versus awareness of another. Once again, the there and then were left behind for an instant of nothingness while the feeling of reaching forward was matched with the quiet stealth of the shadows that I was so familiar with, and for a brief instant, I was the breath drawing into the boy's lungs, the light entering the scared wide pupil of his eyes. Stupefy. The kid hung limply in the air after my stunning charm impacted him. My excitement for the fight, which had turned into partial disbelief at my actions, was souring into a stab of deep-seated annoyance. I freed the 2 students levitating in the air and dragged them all against one side of the corridor without thinking about it. My mind was focused on the image of dark hair, smooth hair, and fair features of one Tom Riddle. Of course, he'd be involved. Noticing the hour, I strode purposefully towards my meeting with Black, a quiet rage simmering in my chest as I loosened my tie and shed my outer robes. Maybe my previous warming charm had been a bit too strong, maybe the brief fight caused it, but deep down I knew that it was indecision that bit at me. The mind exerts will, the body has strength, magic holds power, and the soul is a reflection of them all. I didn't know if Tom had divined it on his own, had already managed to access some forbidden knowledge, or even found the chamber. With that thought, my free hand distractedly touched the thumb-sized, transfigured wooden rooster that remained quiet in my pocket. I had a contingency more or less ready for that situation, but that wasn't my main problem. Riddle is dangerous. I did not know if casual camaraderie that I engineered to exploit him was only skin deep. I didn't know if he simply pretended in all of his interactions with me, or if I had managed to get to him before Voldemort rooted itself in his soul. I had allowed myself to forget just what he could become, maybe blinded by the regular, insightful help that I extracted from him. I hadn't yet attempted to kill him. And now I had just been attacked by 4 students, 4 children that thought their only way to feel adequate was by putting down someone different than them. Hadn't I noticed the absolute cleverness of Tom when we discussed the history of the magical world? Didn't I worry about how powerful he could become if I left him alone? Now we have it, 4 kids turned unreasonably violent because they cannot hope to be anything but shadows in the service of a higher being. Riddle had carefully avoided to be directly linked with those students. I knew that there would be no proof whatsoever linking the attack on me with Tom. Hell, maybe he didn't even intend for them to target me. I ducked under a tapestry and kept power walking, hoping to calm down before reaching my destination. He's just so fucking useful. The real problem wasn't his growing influence or power, the problem wasn't my casual decision to resort to violence. The problem was that even now, the only thing that came to mind when I imagined a world without Riddle ignoring the issue of how I'd actually go about killing him was that I'd lose his insight, and I could only focus on how that would stymie my own growth. I abandoned my musings only once I reached the door of the empty classroom where I was to meet with the student I was meant to tutor, and I resorted to occlumency to push aside my self-doubt and recrimination. I wouldn't cater to the whims of the Black Heir, but Slughorn hadn't been wrong in pointing out how helpful a friendship with him could be, and the prefect-to-be hadn't erred in underlying the eventual need for money of many of my projects. I had some ideas to make that money, simple knowledge of Microsoft and Apple's existence, as well as the economic mess that 2008 would turn out to be, was enough to guarantee me a massive amount of capital, eventually. The problem was that I'd need the money sooner rather than later, and of course, every minute spent on making that money would be a minute stolen from my higher pursuit of magic. Chapter 52, Harry Potter, Chapter 51, Effects 2. I had some ideas to make that money, simple knowledge of Microsoft and Apple's existence, as well as the economic mess that 2008 would turn out to be, was enough to guarantee me a massive amount of capital, eventually. The problem was that I'd need the money sooner rather than later, and of course, every minute spent on making that money would be a minute stolen from my higher pursuit of magic. I entered the small classroom and immediately took notice of the potion equipment arrayed against one wall, and the multitude of ingredients that Slughorn had gracefully made available strewn in organized sections over a white cloth on a few rows of desks. "You're late." The startlingly blue eyes of Orion Black were narrowed in distaste as I turned my attention towards him. He was dressed properly, his outer robes buttoned up, his tie properly secured around his neck, and 6 meters of unyielding, thorny wood up his ass. A wizard is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to. When my words were met with the unimpressed expression Orion Black was so adept at, I shrugged. "I've been delayed." I dropped my outer robes and satchel over an empty desk and strode forward, thinking about how to actually teach something that had made sense to me since the first time Slughorn had shown us the very basics. However, my eyes had been on the Black Heir when I spoke, and I didn't miss the knowing expression that briefly painted itself across his features. "You know something?" I accused him, receiving a mocking tilt of the head in turn. "Of course, I heard that there was something afoot, but it wasn't about me." Orion shrugged uncaringly. "I didn't know you'd be the target, of course, and I refrained from taking part, as it is beneath me. I'm a black, not some kind of monkey." "You're Orion, and not a mere black," I added mockingly, turning my attention back towards the ingredients, the many standard combinations jumping to my eyes like well-lit signs. "Perhaps." The Black Heir slid across the floor with a grace he had clearly been trained for, and soon enough he was hovering next to me. "So? How did you plan to proceed?" I turned towards him with a raised eyebrow. "It depends." "On what?" I grabbed a pair of cauldrons and filled them with water readily available from a barrel placed against one wall before settling them both over unlit burners. "On if you wanted to merely achieve and exceed expectations, or to actually learn the subtle and complex art of potion making." The face of the older Slytherin was impassible as he fought himself. His distaste for the subject was clear to see every time his eyes landed upon the ingredients, which he'd have to touch with his bare hands, and were oftentimes quite disgusting, and the deep-seated need of all Slytherins to aim for the stars. Cautious as he had undoubtedly been taught to be, he offered a question in turn: what would the two paths differ in? I simply shrugged, as I walked among the desks covered with leftover ingredients, making a mental inventory of what we had to work with. The only way for a moderately intelligent wizard to not achieve at least and exceed expectations with potions calibrated for people with no idea of what they're doing is if you don't treat the ingredients properly before adding them to the brew. I glanced at him to let him know that I had already spotted a possible problem, revealing that I was more insightful than what my frame would suggest. I had never seen him brew anything after all. On the other hand, truly understanding what potions are opens a veritable universe of possibilities. It merely requires more time for you to learn it. And of course, more of your effort. The Slytherin fourth year crossed his hands behind the small of his back, straightening it even more. In exchange for what, I wonder? We'll get squared on that later. I dismissed his concern. I've never had to teach this stuff, so I can simply hammer into you the techniques to handle the ingredients despite your disgust for them, and maybe I'll succeed in making you a mediocre pody oneer, or I can attempt to open your eyes, and make you witness the beauty you're now so blind to. I hardly think that it'd be proper for me to enjoy such menial tasks. Orion was unimpressed with my words, but despite myself, I found myself curious about what I could turn this more or less bratty kid into. If what Minerva said was true, the charms professor wanted a fourth year to get started on the new curriculum, and that was pretty extraordinary, as far as normal wizards and witches went. When will it happen again? I grinned while I started to unashamedly quote a man that wasn't yet born. If we succeed in making you see, I can teach you how to bewitch the mind and ensnare the senses. I crossed my arms and minutely tilted back my chin. I can tell you how to bottle fame, brew glory, and even put a stop to death. Despite himself, I spotted the faintest gleam of interest in the eyes of the Blacker as his arms came to rest at his sides, only for his expression to close off once more. It sounds like a lot of work, and I won't make deals without knowing all that they entail. I sighed in annoyance, rolling my eyes at the unnatural adultness of the 14-year-old wizard in front of me. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I don't know, you made up some good points when I mentioned my hazy plans to crossbreed what I'd need for new potions. I might ask for some help in setting up something that'd allow me to research without wasting my time on making money. Economic Council. Orion tilted his head as he considered the implications, maybe some patronage, or introductions to someone in a position of helping you. I sighed in annoyance, a grimace naturally appearing on my face. My ambitions are what landed me in our house, but I have no patience for politicking. As you've noticed, the word games constantly feel like a waste of time. Now that we were essentially bargaining, my mind returned to my previous problem: what was I going to do about Riddle? At the same time, hoping to nudge the kid toward considering learning actual potion making as something even more valuable than what he thought of it at the moment, my hands started to pilfer the needed ingredients while I lit the fire under one of the cauldrons. Petals were taken from the flowers and a silver of a shed unicorn's horn was reduced into powder with a stone pestle. I took 3 thorns from one stem and dropped them whole between one counterclockwise stirring and the 3 clockwise ones that followed. Strike back against the teenagers that got off on fighting those that they perceived as beneath them? What was the point? I could see that their sudden willfulness came from a fire stoked by Riddle's words. Of course, the best end solution would be something to rein in Riddle without alienating him, but how? I didn't know if Tom had deliberately directed those fools against me, and I wouldn't even bother looking for proof. Why would Riddle start playing games with me now of all times? Have you considered that your beasts could provide the money needed to maintain them? Orion asked idly, his eyes eagerly observing on my working hands. It'd take time to reach a stable creature, even longer to figure out a balanced ecosystem, and as you've pointed out, it'd take money that I'd have yet to produce to prepare for herds of whatever I'd end up creating. I more or less shot down his solution while my mind returned to my problem. As I started pouring the powdered horn into my brew, shifting from a silver ladle to a wooden one to add a single snail in the gently bubbling cauldron, my memory, almost without my consent, went back to the changed Runda and to the recent meeting held with the Slug Club, and I had my answer. For all of his undeniable cleverness, Tom was simple enough to read. But had so little managed to unsettle him so much as to resort to some sort of third-degree bullying? The answer was clear enough. How petty. But I could be petty too. In fact, I could do so without Riddle being even aware of it, if I was careful enough. One of the Horcruxes he'd build one day was going to be a ring with the Resurrection Stone, wasn't it? Chapter 53, Harry Potter, Chapter 52, Effects 3. How petty. But I could be petty too. In fact, I could do so without Riddle being even aware of it, if I was careful enough. One of the Horcruxes he'd build one day was going to be a ring with the Resurrection Stone, wasn't it? And just like that, I knew what I was going to do during the winter holidays that Tom spent at Hogwarts. I didn't know what I'd use it for, or if I'd even get to use it. After all, I had no idea how much death was an actual thing in this reality, but I was going to take away Gaunt's ring before Tom could discover of its existence. Only because his actions had caused a minor annoyance to me. The solution would be in turning a single creature, one that you don't necessarily need to be able to replicate, nor one that you'd need to further your research, into something valuable. Orion's voice buzzed in my ear, but while he wasn't wrong, after all, I'd obviously stumble upon many creatures that would be a dead end, both magically and genetically speaking. I still wasn't hearing a solution that'd allow me to be independent while keeping up with my research. Orion kept offering bland insights into my problem while I kept up with my demonstrative brewing, keeping track of the changing smells and colors contained by the cauldron that almost sang in delight under my care. I had added the whole snail, applying to it the same reversing of properties that had allowed me to turn the reflection of the moon into something that opposed the cursed nature of werewolf bites. In a matter of minutes, the concept of sluggishy slow that the slug exemplified was turned into a catalyst. There we are. The brew turned into a silvery white mixture that let blue sparks in the air, and without hesitation, I transfigured 2 silver knives that I hadn't used for my demonstration in 2 glasses, one opportunely sized for my hand. I filled them both and handed the smaller one to the wide-eyed Orion. He took it while his eyebrows rose towards his scalp. I hope you don't think that I'm going to drink this, whatever it is. Reasonable help in exchange for reasonable help. I spoke as I swirled my larger glass, the brew freeing blue sparks in the air that I knew should feel like sparkled water on my tongue, but my dark eyes never left the deep blue ones of the black air. I first brewed the moonshine months ago, but back then it took me a whole night. This is far less powerful, but it took me less than an hour. I grinned above the edge of the silver cup. Spectacular what changes can be wrought when one knows what he's doing. No. Who'd decide what reasonable means? Orion kept the stick up his ass without even noticing, and I downed my drink with 3 deep gulps. Sparks danced on my tongue while the warmth of the brew betrayed the crisp freshness synthesized from the ingredients, and after placing the empty cup on the nearest table, I turned once more towards Orion, who was looking at me like he had just noticed how absolutely mad I could go. We shall both agree on a case-by-case basis. For now, I'd like to try and teach you properly. If we succeed, well, we'll see what comes after, won't we? The black air found himself nodding in agreement despite his previous reticence. It was hard to not be impressed after the spectacle that I had just provided, and I nodded back just in time for a witch to enter without knocking. I was about to caustically remark on her presence when I noticed the badge on her breast. Rubeus Hagrid. The Ravenclaw prefect that entered the room was a blonde girl with a smattering of freckles cast across her nose. Professor Dumbledore is waiting you in his office. What for? I raised an eyebrow and made to ask before the memory of my most recent scuffle flashed before my eyes. Of course, I'll be there immediately. Seeing that her message had been delivered, the prefect turned on her heel and left the room without even looking at Orion, who had tilted his head curiously. Of course, if you're expelled, nothing of what we agreed upon will ever come to pass. I scoffed in his direction as I grabbed my stuff. Don't be a smart-ass, Orion. While I left the room, my mind was already started to work on how I'd go about stealing the resurrection stone for myself. The office of Albus Dumbledore was a small rectangular study located off of the first-floor corridor, to the right of a staircase ascending directly to the 3rd floor. A single, imposing desk dominated the whole space, illuminated by tall, leaded windows overlooking the green expanse of the Hogwarts ground, while against the walls on either side of the room there were tall shelves filled to the brim with books and uncountable knickknacks. Albus let his blue eyes jump from place to place as he entered his office, and he had to smother a smile. As always, the room was characterized, at least in his eyes, by a barely contained merriment. The enchanted shelves contained more trinkets than what they should have been able to. His selection of tomes described an arabesque of possibilities that folded one into another, all the while the sun entered boldly from the windows only to dance across the feathers of a gold and red phoenix, who was resting on the back of the Transfiguration professor's favorite chair. Fox, he greeted the Firebird, I see you've returned from your wandering. A pity that you missed the chance of meeting young Minerva. I think you'd like her. The Phoenix lifted his regal head from under his wing, regarding the wizard with an understanding that defied description, and trilled a reassuring note that brought a chuckle on Albus' lips. Ah, well, there will be other chances. The student about to arrive is another upon which I'd appreciate your insight, my friend. A soft warble accompanied the Phoenix's sudden flaring of wings, and after a single flap, the swan-sized rapacious bird glided over another chair placed next to an open window, his dark eyes never leaving the deep blue ones of the Transfiguration professor. A loud knocking on the door made Albus complete his walk towards his desk, behind which he sat while calling out, "Come in." The unnaturally tall Slytherin that sported his usual mane of unruly, shaggy black hair walked in with his head held high, robes folded over his left arm to reveal the slightly loosened green and silver tie around his neck, and the sleeves of his shirt rolled up to the elbows. Immediately, his dark eyes landed on Fawkes, and for an instant, his feet stopped moving. Albus looked interestedly as sheer wonder painted itself across the student's face. It was easy to see in the slightly open mouth, in the breath catching in his throat, in the twitch of his hands as if he wanted to jump forward to touch the majestic firebird. After a split second, a wide smile opened on his features, his walk resuming at a much more subdued pace until he came to a stop at a respectful distance from the Phoenix. "I hope you know what you're doing, buddy." "How interesting." The Transfiguration Professor leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in his lap as he decided to wait before reprimanding the student for not dressing properly and not addressing the member of the faculty that had summoned him. Fawkes instead simply remained still as it observed the unnaturally tall Slytherin with the same intensity that characterized all of its serious moments. Long seconds passed with the young wizard staring in the eyes of the immortal magical creature, a challenging grin taking the place of the odd smile that appeared at the beginning of the confrontation when Fawkes limited itself to ruffling his feathers. Wide-eyed and with just a hint of trepidation in his stance, Hagrid used his right hand to bring to bear his wand. Instead of holding it as if he was going to cast a spell, however, he simply let it rest flat on his large palm, as if in offering, and Albus mind, after he noticed the knowing glint in the Phoenix's black eyes, connected the dots faster than it was reasonable. The Transfiguration Professor had personally cajoled Fawkes into offering 2 of his feathers to Garrick at the Wandmaker's request, years before, but he hadn't heard of them since. After all, a wand could reveal much of its wielder, and Ollivanders had a strict policy of confidentiality. For the life of his, Albus couldn't divine a situation in which Garrick would freely reveal that information. The wheel turns. Apparently Rubeus Hagrid had been chosen by one of the wands crafted with fox feathers as a core. But how would he know? And what is his purpose now? Fawkes trilled a single high and determined note, which was answered with a shrugging motion by the Slytherin student. "I'm working on it. There's more than one way to skin a cat." "What a horrible saying. I hope you didn't use such sayings around young Minerva, Mr. Hagrid. Have a seat." Chapter 54, Harry Potter, Chapter 53, Effects 4. Fawkes trilled a single high and determined note, which was answered with a shrugging motion by the Slytherin student. "I'm working on it. There's more than one way to skin a cat." "What a horrible saying. I hope you didn't use such sayings around young Minerva, Mr. Hagrid. Have a seat." Reluctantly, and exchanging one last longing glance with Fawkes, the unnaturally tall student walked towards the chair placed in front of Albus' desk, enlarging it silently with a tap of his wand before returning it to a pocket in his trousers. The Transfiguration Professor held back both an apology for not having enlarged the seat himself, a reprimand for using magic without permission, and a praise for the precise nonverbal casting. "His interaction with Fawkes distracted me." Several students reported that, and Dumbledore peered at the much younger wizard from above his half-moon glasses when he spoke those words, his tone peremptory. "You attacked them and left them without their wands afterwards. Also, I can confirm that you didn't alert any member of the faculty of what had occurred. I'm sure that those several idiots didn't mention how they cornered me to engineer a confrontation that they were too incompetent to win." Hagrid fished out of one of his pockets the wands of those he had defeated and safely placed them on the desk of the Transfiguration Professor. "There will none of that language, here, Mr. Hagrid," Albus chided firmly, his eyes briefly darting to the wands in order to reassure himself of their unblemished state. "And you claim that they were the instigators. I have no interest, need, or gain from fighting with mediocre nobodies that I'll forget about in a few days." The shrug was so casually dismissive, so painfully arrogant, that Dumbledore couldn't help but frown. "Yes, I can see how he manages to get along with Tom Riddle." His stern visage still in place, the Transfiguration Professor simply shook his head, and matching the cadence of the words he had just listened to, hoping that it would help to get the message across, he spoke. "Nevertheless, you understand why it isn't acceptable for students to perform unsanctioned, unregulated, unsupervised duels in the corridors. There is an inherent risk in every act of violence that an actual tragedy might unfold." Rubeus started counting on his fingers, his eyes gleaming with cleverness as he spoke between lips tilted in a wry smile. "People shouldn't get used to resorting to violence as a first answer because on the long term it generates a populace of brutes. And wizards like to pretend that they're not animals heavily influenced by the most basic of instincts. Resorting to violence shakes that belief, which in turn causes tensions that few are equipped to handle properly. A part of Albus' mind started immediately to dissect what he had just been told, while the minor fraction of his focus remained on the conversation going on. Also, it's against the rules. The Slytherin student seemed to actually startle at that addiction, only to nod with another faint upwards twitch of his lips. Well, yes, there is that. Those I listed are some of the reasons why those rules are in place. The Albus held back a sigh. I think you'll have to write some lines. So you actually make people write lines for detention? The surprised tone of the Slytherin student managed to summon a sparkle of curiosity in Dumbledore. Ignoring the rude interruption, even if he frowned at the much younger wizard in what was a bland reprimand, the Transfiguration professor asked, "Are you disappointed?" The unnaturally tall Slytherin rose his hand and made a pinching motion with his fingers, keeping them apart by a narrow margin. A bit. Writing the same thing, again and again, is tedious and doesn't really do anything but make my mind wander while my hands go on until they cramp. Maybe that'd teach you the consequences of your actions. Dumbledore rose an unimpressed eyebrow. Also, I'm rescinding your Hogsmeade privileges for the rest of the year, as apparently you cannot be trusted to act in a civil manner when unsupervised around your peers in the school, never mind the village. The unnaturally tall Slytherin accepted the stated punishment without even a twitch, hunching forward on his seat after exchanging another glance with Fawkes, who stared back impassively. But the mechanism of forcing a child to associate detention with bad behavior doesn't quite work on me, not in this case I'm afraid. Hagrid grinned openly, an odd light shining in his eyes. For one, I'd consider detention for the rest of the year an acceptable price for outshining those lackluster people even in an ambush they implemented on me. Albus narrowed his eyes at the ironic tone the student had used to refer to his peers, but let it go, as he had refrained from calling them idiots once more. Secondly, the unnaturally tall Slytherin rose 2 fingers of his right hand. Given that of course it's clear to you what were the correct actions to take, I think it'd be more effective, in terms of me learning my lesson, of course, for you to explain what you'd have done, to convince me that my choices were flawed. This is how a lesson sticks, I think. I'm not required to explain myself to you, young man. A displeased frown etched itself on the Transfiguration professor's features then, and disrespecting your elders isn't doing you any favors. Do not think that the staff hasn't noticed your barely acceptable behavior. You'll do as you're told because we are the staff, and you're a student. It's that simple. I'm sorry, Professor, and I want to make clear that I have the utmost respect for you and admire your accomplishments. Hagrid sounded almost genuine when he spoke. But I can't truly bear to play the part of a child caught misbehaving when I think I'm in the right. Mr. Hagrid, you're 13. Albus stressed out as he sat straighter in his chair. How could it be that a boy as brilliant as Rubeus undoubtedly was, couldn't see how unacceptable his behavior was? Bah, age is just a number, wisdom can be found in the oddest of places. Hagrid gestured dismissively with his hands while his eyes darted again towards the phoenix perched nearby. Maybe I was just born with an old soul. Fawkes gave an amused squawk right there and then, only to proceed to fly out of the window immediately after. Shaking his head minutely, Albus tried another way to reach out to the boy. What would you expect a detention to entail? Well, for starters, to talk about what has happened and what I did wrong. Hagrid had the audacity of outright grinning as he spoke, and then to underline what a proper, acceptable reaction would have been like. Even if I'm not sure we can manage that without a little bit of hypocrisy showering us on the way. Intrigued despite himself, the older wizard rose an eyebrow, inviting the student to go ahead, and silently indicating that expected Hagrid to elaborate on what he meant by hypocrisy. Draco dormiens nunquam titilandus. The Slytherin positively oozed smugness as he rolled his massive shoulders. It's the school's motto, isn't it? If we are honest about it, I acted exactly as a Hogwarts student should, and showed those barely average wizards that actions have consequences that may go beyond their expectations. The idea of tickling a sleeping dragon might be funny, but they'll think twice before a repeat performance. But the victims, Dumbledore stretched the word with a particularly stern tone, all agree on the fact that you were the first to cast a spell. And since when the voice of the many was enough to swap a truth with a lie? Hagrid seemed supremely unconcerned with what was going on, his attention returning to the window that Fawkes had just left through. In any case, it doesn't matter much. I find your disinterest and dismissal of the gravity of the situation to be quite worrying. Dumbledore spoke softly but his blue eyes were like chips of ice. We're talking about a grave offense, and you insist on thinking that it doesn't matter much. Well, ultimately, without a reliable witness, and the parts involved in a scuffle are never reliable by definition, the truth of the events cannot be confirmed. The unnaturally tall Slytherin shrugged once more, as if declaring that particular topic closed. That'd be true enough, and if this was a court, it would be relevant. It was hard to not like the rhetoric banter that the third-year student had chosen to defend himself with, but Dumbledore had a duty to guide and direct all the children that entered Hogwarts, and despite his uncanny intelligence and maturity, Rubeus was still exactly that, a child. Nevertheless, a student of your intellect could have contrived a way to avoid violence, couldn't you? I could have used long words to confuse them and to slip away. Rubeus hummed, his eyes rising towards the ceiling as if he was considering that situation for the first time. But that would only have delayed the problem, but I cannot explain the shades of a sunset to the blind. I needed to use a tongue they could understand, and as they sought violence, this was the fastest method to have them back off for the rest of their time in this hallowed halls. Well, considering your well-argumented objections, Dumbledore spoke with a barely restrained smile under his white beard when he saw an almost hopeful surprise blossom on Hagrid's face. You'll have no issues in writing 3 separate essays of 2 feet each on why violence isn't acceptable in the corridors, why students are to follow the rules, and why you should be respectful to the staff and other students alike. Let's say, for the next week, and be aware that I expect an exceptional quality in each of the essays, Mr. Hagrid. Oddly enough, the problematic younger wizard seemed outright pleased by this detention. This sounds entirely more effective, I agree. Still, the Slytherin student seemed too satisfied for Dumbledore's tastes, and so he added, of course, the banishment from visiting Hogsmeade also stands. Of course. Rubeus simply nodded with a quirky grin, casting another glance at the window Fawkes had flown out of before looking back at the Transfiguration Professor. May I go now? Dumbledore took a deep breath at the absolutely unapologetic boy sitting in front of him. One of the feathers of Fawkes had become part of a wand that chose that boy, and while Albus was impressed that such a young man could recognize in a split second the hazy connection that the wand could hold with the Phoenix, it didn't help the Transfiguration Professor in how to deal with his misbehavior. It was interesting that he'd argue so clearly to be treated more as an adult that made an honest mistake than the misguided child he was, and Albus was willing to try his method. If only to check whether he actually believed what he said or if he simply found the mindless boredom found in writing lines a worse punishment than having to write an argument 3 different essays. There was also the absolutely unconcerned reaction to his banishment from visiting Hogsmeade, which would have struck any other third-year student quite harshly. I wouldn't want to ban him from his extracurricular studies. Albus of course knew of the classroom that the student had repurposed as a specialized potion station, and he could forbid Rubeus from it for a few months, but Hogwarts was a school, and withholding knowledge in a place of learning settled with the Transfiguration Professor. You may go. The aged wizard nodded thoughtfully, and his exceptional brain kept running on those topics as he observed the retreating back of the unnaturally tall Slytherin. Where before he had assumed the boy's quirks as a result of the difficult life one so different had to live, now he simply felt that there was something he wasn't understanding about the third-year student. And without his conscious input, a part of his rather exceptional mind started to churn about Rubeus Hagrid, picking apart all that Albus knew about him only to analyze it under different perspectives and put it together once more. How interesting. Of course, while I've built up to this situation for it to be this way, the main strength of this arc was not the fighting, but the chat with Dumbledore, with only a bit of the blatant parallelism I'm keeping up with the MC and Riddle. I know that I wasted a few chapters worth of this FIC on McGonagall, Riddle, Dumbledore, Black, and Slughorn, but as I have said, a first-person POV isn't enough to build the kind of massive FIC I want Meddling Giant to be. I need meaningful supporting characters that are not one-dimensional. Having said that, now that I've worked on the background characters a bit, I'll be able to power through much of the remaining years at Hogwarts only with the MC's POV. This should speed up the whole thing. As I had begun revealing with his first lessons of both charms and transfiguration, I can now confirm that incantations and wand movements are crutches more than anything else. It was the only way for me to explain accidental magic in this setting. You've seen the MC do something with his wand in a little fight that I used to showcase the main difference between how he casts magic and how all the other students do so. The only thing that came to mind, to justify the pervasive and almost mandatory existence of incantations, that make no sense, and wand movements, besides the epidemic laziness that some authors use to justify why any SI is capable of doing stuff no other manages to, is that incantations and wand movements speed up considerably the casting of any kind of spell. That's all there is to it. With deep understanding or not, incantations trigger a mental pattern in the wizard or witch, like a mnemonic device to remember a specific paragraph of a book, that immediately generates the spell, relative to that mental pattern. This of course has the effect of making a large arsenal of spells a viable, an almost mandatory necessity for any adult wizard or witch. On the other hand, relying on the proven and true method that Minerva is starting to leave behind with her superior transfiguration, but only in regards to transfiguration, limits the flexibility of the wizard. As I've underlined in this chapter, Hagrid uses the usual, banal spells to attack, but his shield, which forms much more slowly, remains up almost independently. What Hagrid performed in the previous chapters with his wand and the concept of fire, isn't something that could be achieved in the same way with an incendio. What I am trying to say is that incantations refer to spells that, varying a bit from wizard to wizard, based upon the individual's characteristics such as ability, practice, and attitude, have always the same effect. Incendio cannot be manipulated to generate a fire whip, no matter how much one trains with it, because incendio generated a burst of fire, period. Of course, if someone hammered on it long enough, incendio could be the starting point, and practice and determination could allow the wizard to then generate a fire whip. That is to say that the fire whip would be a more or less unconscious application of Hagrid's method after the standard casting of a spell. Chat with Black. The chat with Black hinted at some events that could eventually unfold, and it also addressed some of the MC's thoughts and plans about his more or less drunk ramblings at the last slug party. Of course, with this arc, I confirm that the Deathly Hallows will be part of the story, because they're just too good to let them pass by without me taking a bite. Now the MC is in the odd position of wanting to get back at Riddle, because ultimately it's obvious that the attack is Tom's fault more than that of the kids at school, and not risking his enmity, because he just confirmed just how damn useful he can be for Hagrid's main interest, which, I remind everyone, is to learn and craft magic. The Phoenix. I finally got around to seeing Secrets of Dumbledore. My god, how disgustingly low can a franchise go? The whole Phoenix appearing to a Dumbledore because of reasons, the super obscurial that changes opinion on right and wrong with zero character development to sustain it, the building up of a relationship between Scamander and Tina only for the latter to completely vanish. The magical animal that actually chooses the leader of all wizards when the first movie of Fantastical Beasts is all engineered around the idea that wizard kind dismisses all the magical animals as unimportant beyond the worth of their parts. Yet, beyond the little references I've made to the first movie, I'm dropping that shit like it has the plague. So, Dumbledore is actually a fantastic person, an extraordinary wizard and whatnot, and because of his own merits instead of this shit prophecy plotting, he has managed at some point to befriend Fawkes, and that's it. Also, I'm more and more convinced that Ollivander told Albus about the Phoenix Wands only when the latter asked about Tom Riddle, revealing that he was indeed Voldemort. With that precedent, it only makes sense that Garrick would keep the headmaster posted on the fate of Fawkes' second feather. As you've noticed, the MC has the habit of getting slightly tipsy on his own drinks from time to time. Unfortunately, while the last time it passed with no consequences, this time it loosened his tongue just enough to make him mouth off at the wrong moment. For all of his genius, this Dumbledore isn't the wisest old man to have ever lived, trying to steer Harry Potter towards martyrdom. While of course he's more likely to interact in a peculiar manner with his students, he's still a member of the faculty, and Hagrid's consistent barely concealed lacking of respect must be addressed, as all schools have the underlining purpose of getting students, adults to be, used to follow the proper hierarchy. Chapter 55, Harry Potter, Chapter 54, Rich Hunt I. The sun had finished setting while I completed my preparations. It's time. In the small clearing that I was sharing with the two muggles I had rescued in the French countryside, there was also a simple, wooden cage containing a rather large stag that I had previously cajoled into drinking a rather complex brew that had a single purpose: make the creature a harder target for transformed werewolves. I didn't think to ask Minerva if there was a way for transfiguration to give a temporary humanity to the stag. It would have made it a better target. Both Paul and Marie drank their respective vials with a slight grimace, only to toss them on the ground hardened by the cold under the trees of the Forest of Dean. The full moon would rise soon, and I followed their example by downing a potion myself. It tasted of rushing wines and the quiet footsteps. Immediately it steadied my heartbeat, which turned from fast drumming into a slow, deliberate hammering. Stalking Shadow was a potion I had to link through the use of silver of the stag's prongs to the creature's life, with the mirroring effect to the moon itself, and with a drop of blood to myself. Sadly, its esoteric nature meant that it could be brewed only by the one destined to drink it, could be used only with the full moon under the open sky, and its effects would die either with the stag, or with the first appearance of the dawn. Going against any of those conditions would immediately invalidate the story that the potion was meant to be telling, as such nullifying the effects. It had taken more or less an hour of care each night for all the previous month, and it had consistently needed adjustments on the fly. While not as complex as the Felix, and undoubtedly less useful as a general-purpose brew, I felt that the many experiments I had conducted since I first awoke in this world were somewhat coming together in the unholy combination of ritualism and potion-making that felt due natural to me. On Paul and Marie, I had tried before potions meant to either restrain the transformation, oppose it outright, or simply shift the human mind of the muggles into something more capable of accepting the hunting instinct of the werewolf. I had used a multitude of properties in my many attempts. I had ranged from my own original mirroring effect that I had discovered when treating the wounds responsible for turning Paul and Marie in the first place, to highly experimental combination of unusual ingredients that I had often been unable to collect personally to reinforce selected characteristics with some small ritualism. Ultimately, however, my attempts to work against the transformation proved themselves ineffective. The curse was simply too deeply rooted in werewolves to be simply broken from outside forces. Since pushing back against it didn't seem to work, this attempt was meant to exhaust the curse upon a single, successful hunt. At least for a single full moon, let's see if there is any hope for this. I breathed in deeply as the potion I drank primed my body just slightly beyond its capabilities for the trial that it'd have to endure, and as the full moon started to rise, Paul and Marie started to change. The transformation itself was as always horrifying, but where before it had always been characterized by absolute agony while the werewolf's instinct took over, now there was some sort of excitement, an eagerness that accompanied each snap of bone, each warble as the human throats turned into something capable of deep growls and snarling madness. With the speed born of experience, a selected sequence of charms masked my presence, leveraging the concept of shadow that I was so familiar with because of my father's sacrifice to heights never achieved before. With my wand of holly, I simply tapped one leaf that I had taken from the shadow tree. And it burned a light in a dark smoke that fell backward on me, covering my form with the unimportant, and easily dismissed nature of every shadow that had ever been cast. The stag bellowed in fright as the previously unthreatening humans in the clearing became apex predators, bloodlust and need for something to chase filling them to the brim as the transformation ran its course. Just as the werewolves completely took over, the cage I had kept their prey in opened, and their target ran away in the dark with all the speed of a potion-enhanced creature that feared for its life. And it was on that primal fear powering the prey's run that the werewolves' attention snapped onto. The smaller of the two cursed creatures, Marie, chuffed as it started sprinting directly after the stag, while Paul took off at an angle. Neither had noticed my presence, and after a second to make sure they wouldn't suddenly manage to pierce through my newly enhanced cloak of shadows, I ran after them, my long leg and half-giant's blood granting me a speed through the wilderness unheard of in a mere human. I breathed regularly under the empowering effects of the potion that would leave me with the conclusion of the hunt, and with the full moon shining above the forest of Dean, I could make out the way between dark patches of blackness under the trees and silvery curtains that showed me the barest hint of the deep gouges that a werewolf's claws cut into the hardened ground. I was of course quickly left behind. The simple potion that I had prepared to power up my body couldn't raise me to the heights needed to follow creatures cursed into being one of the most deadly predators of the world. I'd need a ritual for that. I didn't need the recurring image of my father turning into a tree for me to discard that option. Besides the inherent difficulty in finding someone or some creature that would genuinely wish to freely sacrifice themselves, I had my fill of improvised magics that required blood and suffering as a price. Of course, the stag that the two werewolves were hunting might find my thoughts a tad bit hypocritical, but I couldn't truly consider deers on the same level of the much more complex, and more importantly aware, magical creatures, never mind humans. If this experiment of mine had success, the two werewolves would return human immediately after the killing blow on the stag. It would mean that the potion I used to loosely link the prey with the predators had survived the effects of the transformation, and that the death of the stag would release enough power in this hunting ritual not to push back the transformation, but to more or less trick it into believing that enough blood had been spilled. After all, no animal hunted without reason. Once food had been provided, there would be no need for the werewolf, and that should allow the intrinsic human nature of Marie and Paul to emerge once more under the full moon. I ran straight against a branch hanging at shoulder height, only for it to bend in the direction I was going and return to its original position without a sound. My foot slammed onto the bed of a small course of water that hadn't frozen yet with the winter without making a sound, and my boot remained dry as I kept moving forward. Ultimately my potion had been aptly named, even if its many effects would all come to an end with the stag's life. I kept following the faint, but unmistakable in their freshness, tracks of Marie under the moonlit trees, and I distractedly appreciated the crisp, nightly air in a way that I had until now discarded as unimportant. I was stalking behind a couple of werewolves, conducting an experimental ritual that came at no cost of innocent lives, and I had as the final purpose an actual cure for something that plagued mankind for thousands of years. I reached a clearing just as my ears registered the snapping of bone, followed but the intense, metallic tang of blood being sprayed in the air. The effects of stalking shadow abandoned me as I briefly stumbled, righting myself in time to see the two werewolves feasting messily on their prey. I took an exasperated sigh. Another failure. With no warning and a snarl, both werewolves turned towards my position, their eyes burned of molten gold with dissatisfied bloodlust, and as they started sniffing the air, their hackles rose. I apparat away before they could start sprinting towards me. Another failure, I repeated in my head, yet, they followed the prey I had prepared before looking for anything else. Maybe I'm onto something there. I walked tiredly into my home, my eyes glancing briefly at Aragog's egg that was still waiting in stasis for me to hatch it, only to sprawl myself on the giant-sized bed that I had more or less clobbered together with trees I had taken from the Forest of Dean since my father's death. Immediately, the tiredness caused by my failed experiment claimed me, and I fell asleep. Chapter 56, Harry Potter, Chapter 55, Rich Hunt 2. A few nights after my last failed attempt at finding a cure for lycanthropy, I dizzily stumbled off the night bus before the purple triple-decker exploded away into the night once again, my hands running over my grey beard in the vain attempt to tame the mane I had once more adopted as a disguise, while I studied the surroundings from under my deep hood. The few roads of village of Little Hangleton was barely illuminated by the occasional street lamp whose light failed to pierce far through the falling snow. I only had vague memories of the village's description, both from the Goblet of Fire and the Half-Blood Prince, so I resigned myself to explore a bit before finding the location of my prize. Distractedly touching several of my many pockets, checking for the vials they contained with a reflex that I had picked up while searching for Ravenclaw's diadem, I walked over the freshly fallen snow with nary a sound. The thick, grey goop-like substance I had brewed and applied under my footwear achieved its purpose by allowing me to walk lightly above the white cover that separated me from the ground. Riddle Manor was relatively easy to spot even in the dark, the small hill that dominated the village, if one was so generously inclined as to attribute such a title to what amounted to a 20 meters uphill slope, stood out thanks to the few lit windows that almost looked like eyes suspended in the night. From there, I moved along the desert roads and empty alley until I found a graveyard, and moving in an outward spiral from there, I eventually located my true target. Not far from the dirt road that rolled northwest from the village, there was a random mess of hedges that curtailed a part of what should have been some sort of yard for the shack that hosted my target. The house itself was a barely standing conglomerate of planks of wood, and I couldn't help but shake my head in denial. How could an adult wizard, no matter how stupid, be so utterly incapable as to live like a squatter in an abandoned building? Then again, simple charms can turn a part of the floor in a warm, soft surface, but still. For all of their pride in their bloodline, apparently, the Gaunts felt that they could live in a pigsty without harming their impressive ego. With a familiarity that grew with each use, my wand twirled in a tight circle above my head, and shadows followed my command. All sounds around me dampened, and I became just another unimportant blur of darkness. I walked across the distance that separated me from the door of the shack without feeling anything that could betray the presence of wards. Then again, besides a random act of aggression, I hadn't seen the man do anything but curse a random ministry employee in the memories shown in the Half-Blood Prince, but while the wizard I was about to rob was capable with a wand, he wasn't really bright, and if nothing else, the overinflated sense of ego of the Gaunts meant that he never bothered to protect his property. I fished a pear-shaped vial the size of a coconut from one of my pockets and swirled it lightly in the darkness of the night. The grey liquid it contained simmered with faint streaks of white. The draught of the living death was a ridiculously easy potion to brew, but besides being easy to detect, it affected only those stupid enough to touch it directly with their skin, and had an effect capable of being countered only with a specific antidote only when drunk. Creeping slumber was born with a precise purpose. I uncorked it and poured just where the door met the more or less rotten wood of the patio, being careful to not breathe as faint grey smoke started to seep under the entrance. The story that gave meaning, and thus challenged magic, into the brew, was one of slow, unavoidable tiredness, one that shared a few elements with the stalking shadow potion that enhanced greatly my stealth. Once I was done pouring, I stepped aside and remained still beside the door. To any observer, I'd be just like another shadow on the wall. While my brew acted, I simply had to wait. I breathed slowly, doing my best to remain calm, despite what I was about to do. Oh, I had faced danger before, but werewolves, while terrible in their savagery and unpredictable in their answers to my potions, could be worked around. Terrible as they could be, there was a reason why the world wasn't completely overrun by them. On the other hand, wizards had that terribly human spark that made the impossible possible even for muggles, never mind for those with access to magic. My brew should work, My potion skills was one field where I didn't feel pressured to constantly research. I had a gift for it that constantly surprised me, but there was the absurd possibility that my target was still awake and that he'd notice, or that there was a magical snake ready to warn him. I could only hope for the best. I remained still until I spotted the smoke generated by my brew starting to seep out once more from the house, and with a last deep breath, I cast the extremely useful bubblehead charm around me, tapping the door with my wand and ducking under the threshold. The shack had a single living room that occupied most of the space with an unlit fireplace with a broken chimney, but I didn't even need to explore the other small rooms to see him. Thick hair so matted with dirt it could have been any color, and several of his teeth were missing as he snored on a broken couch. Morphin Gaunt lived up to his surname as his cheekbones cast deep shadows on the rest of his face to the dim light of my wand. The place was much warmer than it should have been considering the lack of flames dancing in the fireplace, and I could almost feel the thick cover that Morphin's warming charm maintained over the room. My eyes were wide as I studied my target, while I bared my teeth once I spotted the fabled resurrection stone. It's not like I need it, but this really feels right. Remaining somewhat large on a finger that looked like the leg of a pale spider, there was a ring that, if I were to listen to what my meta-knowledge told me, had been and would be cause for much strife and unneeded grief. I couldn't contain the flash of triumph as I reached forward, my wand still trailed on the man, and easily slipped off my prize from the last pure blood of the line of Slytherin. The dark stone gleamed coldly under the light of my wand as I slipped the ring in one of my pockets only to fish out a rough copy of it. Among the countless lost things I had searched for in Hogwarts, I hadn't been unduly surprised when I spotted a small, golden ring. Crystallizing a potion so that it looked like an onyx hadn't been too difficult. After all, shadows were one of the things that I was very familiar with. Now he has still a magical ring, even if, just like the one I stole, it won't actually do anything. In the complete silence of the room, the constant snoozing of Morphin was the only thing I could hear as I slipped on the fake ring, and while my heart thundered with excitement, my hands remained steady while I retraced my steps, and soon enough I was closing the door behind me. As I walked at a brisk pace atop the snow that didn't bother with turning my steps into tracks, I briefly considered stealing the man's wand while the effects of the creeping slumber persisted, only to shake my hat and pop the bubble that still contained my head. The whole point of my excursion had been to get back at Tom without him ever knowing about it, just like his words and actions had likely pushed those kids to ambush me at school. For that transgression, I felt like we were even, and with a last glance at the daunting shack of Morphin Gaunt, I operated away. I popped back into reality still under a snowing sky, only to stride with purpose under a shadow that I had learned to spot even in complete darkness. With the years, since Hagrid Sr.'s death, I had grown accustomed to the uniquely odd feeling that the tree gave off. It was a subtle thing, something that just like the shadow it represented, was there without being in any way meaningful. It was supremely easy to use a few leaves from the tree to cast a specific spell, or to enhance a specific property of a potion, but I still understood very little of what it actually was. I stopped under the threshold of my home and glanced back at the tree that maintained the protective ward, raising my wand and casting a silent lumos as I did so. The ash tree had a trunk that was composed of two intertwining parts that followed each other in a tight spiral, and the light wood was covered by liquid shadows cast by ever-moving, dark leaves that I had just started to experiment with. Over the snow-covered ground, the tree threw a shadow that I knew engulfed the entirety of my home. The magic that had birthed the tree was undeniably powerful, and while I never suffered intruders of any sort, I couldn't tell if that was because of the tree or simply because of how isolated my home was. I'll need to study that in depth. I resigned myself to the idea while I quashed the familiar self-loathing that rose at the memory of how I had exploited the dying man that believed me his son, and entered my home. Shrugging off my patchworked cloak, I moved towards the living room instead of my bedroom, where I settled into the large armchair that faced my unlit fireplace. Once more, just like I did years before, I rose my holly and phoenix wand in front of my face, briefly loosing myself into the meaning of fire, into what it felt like, into what it could be if properly directed, and blew. My breath rushed above the wand with a deliberate and light-foot twist, igniting immediately after only to deposit itself like an unfolding napkin made of yellow and orange flames over the waiting cold ashes. The magically created fire illuminated the room immediately, and warmth chased away the coldness of that winter's night. I fished out the resurrection stone and studied it under the warm light. The faded mark of the peverils could be spotted on one side, while the onyx-like stone wetly reflected the dancing flames without a care. It's not like I have anyone to call, is it? A self-mocking bout of laughter escaped my lips then. For some reason, I couldn't contain the sudden hilarity. Even counting the dead, I was alone. After a while spent feeling sorry for myself, my eyes landed on a pouch of cloth that contained a certain object, and as my mind returned to the problem that Tom Marvolo Riddle undoubtedly still was, I felt justified in feeling the need for some wisdom. I lifted my wand once more, smiling lightly at the familiar rush that the length of holly and phoenix feather made run along my arm, and summoned to me the pouch. I opened it, and spent a second observing the Ravenclaw diadem that rested within. I had used it exactly once, and I would have been a liar if I said that I had been unnerved at the revelation of what exactly it was. What does one reach by confronting oneself? The reflection of myself offered by the diadem was strange indeed, but its words had shaken me deeply. Also, once I had determined it wouldn't simply deliver me distilled knowledge, I simply decided to get busy with what I could do. That meant focusing on my studies, on my experiments, and my hopes for the future. When magic is involved, lying to yourself can become crippling. That was obvious enough, wasn't it? Even more when I considered the undeniable truth of the triangle of mind, body, and magic containing the soul. That Tom told me. I inwardly grimaced at the usefulness of Riddle's words. Those had been fundamental to push me towards my new revelations when it came to lycanthropy. The ritual that I had attempted to use with Marie and Paul after all was meant to bring together their minds with their body's instincts, following the direction of the curse instead of pushing against it. I hadn't worn the diadem since that first time, since the magic within it asked me what I truly wanted. And maybe, just maybe, my actions up to this point were answer enough. Besides the knowledge relative to Horcrux and sacrifice, I had been open with my ideas and thoughts. I had even allowed myself to write down Parseltongue when I had reflected upon the merits of some inherited traits, and while I didn't parade it, I would be very surprised if Tom hadn't noticed it. With the petty theft of the Resurrection Stone, I felt avenged. I even felt like I had punished Tom enough for the actions that led to those idiots ambushing me. But that didn't solve the problem I was facing. My hand whispered against a pocket of my trousers, where I always kept a rooster transfigured into a wooden coin. There hadn't been signs of the basilisk just yet. The spiders in the castle behaved normally from what I could tell. And even if I had thought about the option of figuring out a way to sacrifice the unborn Aragog in order to craft some foolproof way to be warned when the Chamber of Secrets got opened, it smelled strongly of cowardice. Besides, a necromancula was rare indeed, unique more than rare on the Isles, and with the multitude of children that Aragog had the potential to produce, giving him up would sacrifice any hope that my potential business of crossbreeding had to take off reasonably quick. While I was more than willing to spend years researching, I didn't want to spend that amount of time looking after my economic ventures. There'd be options in the Muggle world to make some money, but a proper magical business would destroy the need of keeping everything completely secret, as it'd be the case were I to illegally do everything that came to mind. Not that I balked at the idea of breaking the law, but it sounded like a stupid problem that could be easily be diverted with the proper piece of paper justifying whatever bullshit I came up with. I blinked tiredly at the diadem in my hands, my eyes landing briefly on the sapphire that gleamed in answer to the flames dancing in my fireplace, and I sighed once more. I could use some good ideas about that as well. I closed my eyes, and in an instant, I was standing in a world made of grey, a reflection of myself but with sapphire blue eyes grinning widely at me. So, he started, you made a decision. Chapter 57, Harry Potter, Chapter 56, Snowflake's Eye. The sun shone balefully through the faint cover of clouds of the barely there spring, casting a lukewarm light over the stone floor and the increasingly filled shelves of the Runda. Not much had changed since Minerva's addiction to our secret room. The double doors stood as impressive as ever, a crystallized sequence of changes whose links could be found only in our Gryffindor witch's instinctive understanding of what was and what could be. The cabinet with my many different brews remained against one wall, while our fireplace blazed happily, quietly warming up the otherwise cold room. My eyes trickled over the orderly bounded notes on the shelves, the chosen tomes that either Tom, Minerva, or I owned and left in place for the other two to use, and the personal large desks that hosted our current projects. Tom kept a blank stack of parchment on the left of his table, with a single inkwell with quill ready at a slight angle against the edge of the unadorned chair where he sat. Minerva maintained an order that was almost obsessive among her belongings, with bookmarks placed sequentially in the tomes she kept in a neat stack, ready for consultation, and a precise line containing the 3 different colors she used to differently underline her notes. On the other hand, my desk was massive with my notes, books, quills, and inkwells describing a messy half-circle that spanned across topics with a secret logic line linking them together, when studying and researching as I did. I simply could almost never contain myself to a single subject, because every implication of the effects of transfiguration should have a similar one in charms, Every star needed for a potion had an exact cause in the properties derived by ingredients that could be influenced by the stars themselves. But my attention wasn't on any of my ongoing projects. Minerva was reading quietly in a high-back armchair, and the topic she was getting started on interested me greatly, if only because of its long-reaching possibilities. Alchemy, I asked as I sat next to her, my eyes darting over the open pages before she closed the tome, glancing at me with an exasperated mannerism that I enjoyed being able to cause. You could at least have the decency of letting me actually study before badgering me for my understanding of the subject at hand, Rubeus. Her green eyes were like shards of glass as she stared at me, and the shy sun managed to shine a bit over them. As always, my notes and thoughts will appear on the shelves once I'm done, and not a second earlier. Oh, come on. Stop pestering me, she scoffed as she opened once more her tome. Clearly you're only looking for something to distract yourself with, but I'm rather busy. Find Tom and play with him a little, won't you? If I manage well enough, Professor Dumbledore might introduce me to Flamel himself. My eyes widened at her revelation and I wisely kept my mouth shut. Flamel, More than his achievements in alchemy, what interested me was the sheer amount of insanity that he might have witnessed in the centuries he spent alive. And while I knew nothing of the subject in question, I doubted that it was all that the man ever researched in his long life. Nevertheless, I stifled a chuckle at Minerva's snappish reaction while I forcefully stopped myself from thinking about my raid at the Gaunt's home. I'll have to have a talk with Tom at some point. I've already delivered the punishment, but I should try and make him reconsider his puppeteering ways when they involve me, if only tangentially. I could resume my analysis of divination or try and seek a more precise connection between each ingredient and combinations of numbers, hoping to find an unreasonably powerful combination, but while the first option attracted me somewhat, the latter felt like a waste of time for all of their faults when it came to magical research. Wizards and witches had always been intent with tries upon tries, hoping that a large enough number of experiments would support the thesis that at the time they fancied. Ultimately, I'd have to fish out the oldest tomes that focused on the study of ingredients only, and start compiling a catalogue. What wouldn't I give for a file Excel? I took a deep breath and looked once more out of the circular window of stained glass that dominated the nearest wall. Treetops that occasionally still lacked leaves because of the slowly receding winter were like skeletal hands attempting to emerge from the otherwise emerald sea of the pines, while the coat of clouds hid from me the open sky. Maybe because I felt like I had been remotely successful in my last attempts at curing lycanthropy, maybe because I was simply tired, or maybe it was the relief born of my last conversation within the diadem. In any case, for the first time since I could remember, I didn't feel like studying mindlessly until inspiration struck me. And Minerva was such a great sport at offering a distraction. Have you met Fawkes? Professor Dumbledore mentioned his Phoenix companion, but no, I haven't had the pleasure. The Gryffindor witch gave up on her studies and balanced the closed boon on the armrest of her armchair, fixing me with a penetrating gaze as she did so. Not for the first time, I found myself noticing how apt her animagus transformation was. There was something predatory about her when she decided to bring the full scope of her attention onto you, and I didn't need to see her play Quidditch to know that the game lent itself well to her chasing instinct. Still, with the mention of Fawkes I had managed to rouse her from her studying mindset, which turned her from an unresponsive stone wall into something far more reactive and insightful. As if to confirm my opinion, she spoke before I could needle her about my random encounter with the Firebird. You seem more relaxed, Rubeus, less wound up. Her green eyes never left mine, but I spotted the faint twitching of the tendons of her left hand. Were she in cat form, I didn't doubt that her tail would be moving erratically, as if she was about to spot a prey to chase. Maybe I am. I shrugged, deciding to give her what she wanted before she tried to hound it out of me, my mind turning to my last meeting with my other self into Ravenclaw diadem. What happened? Once more, I turned my head from her towards the large window that allowed me to peer over the treetops. How to explain what I had decided without coloring her expectations of Tom? I know that I can't control everything, and that I'll simply have to deal with all of the consequences of my choices instead of nitpicking the good and ignoring the bad. Minerva snorted uncharacteristically as she rose from her seat, her back ramrod straight as she eyed the rest of the Runda. Any of my brothers could have told you that, even if they need a bit of ear tweaking to remember it from time to time. I'd like for them to have access to the Runda once they become mature enough to appreciate it. I blinked slowly while I returned my attention to the witch that was now looking almost wistfully at the bound notes present on the shelves. I didn't know you had brothers. My mind, however, was already running along another train of thought. The Runda was fantastic to have only for me and my chosen ones, but I wouldn't spend all my life in Hogwarts, the world was simply too vast for me to not explore, as I had already been doing. But I don't want to turn this into something cheap that everyone can access, or something inherited only by virtue of blood. You never asked. Minerva shrugged, mimicking uncaringness while I could hear a slight reproach in her voice. It's not like our friendship is built around anything but the study of magic, is it? Chapter 58, Harry Potter, Chapter 57, Snowflakes 2. But I don't want to turn this into something cheap that everyone can access, or something inherited only by virtue of blood. You never asked. Minerva shrugged, mimicking uncaringness while I could hear a slight reproach in her voice. It's not like our friendship is built around anything but the study of magic, is it? I grimaced at her words. It wasn't like I had ever planned to stick around her or Tom any longer than needed to boost my learning, and my first act in this life had been to ritually sacrifice my father, so I really didn't feel like discussing familiar ties at any point of my time with my two companions. Never mind Riddle's orphan status. Still, what could I say? I am sorry I never actually cared for you beyond what you can provide for my studies. It might have started like that. I conceded, my dark eyes finding hers while I donned an apologetic smile and walked towards her. The topic of our families never came up, and I had my reasons to keep mine secret. I caught myself before saying too much, but the gleam of interest had now been roused in Minerva's eyes, and I knew that I would have to either lie or trust her, at least with a version of the truth. Even so, I tried to distract her. What are your brothers like? A sharp smile colored her features as she thought about her family. Malcolm and Robert, my mother and I had to teach them to not flaunt their magic, they're prone to cause mayhem. Then her eyes narrowed and returned to me with the precision of a predator on the prowl. But do not think you've managed to distract me, you mentioned reasons. She repeated while she crossed her arms, her lips thinning in displeasure at my attempted deflection, and not something like keeping Tom from feeling excluded, are they? I was suddenly feeling uncomfortable, and another topic I had touched with the diadem rose to my mind. It was one of the issues that had been raised in our very first meeting. Many of my decisions when it came to what knowledge to share in the Runda were dictated by fear of what Tom could become, and I knew that whatever I shared with Minerva had the potential of making its way into Riddle's possession. He, very much like me, wasn't one to leave any opportunity slip by, and this conversation went out of track faster than I could react to. A version of the truth it is. My home situation is closer to Tom's than yours. I forcefully kept myself from grimacing at the last memory I had of my father, but I enjoy my privacy, and I can look after myself, so keeping it a secret. Minerva's expression went from stern to concerned in a fraction of a second, and she had already taken a step forward with her hands tightly holding my much bigger ones as she spoke. You don't have to. I enjoy your company. I smiled at her soulful reaction, even as I shook lightly my head to dismiss her worry. What I tell, and don't tell, about my life outside the castle. Not that you ever mention it, and the topic did raise in our conversations before, I'm sure of it. She cut me lightly, and we shared a small smile at the easing of the tension we hadn't realized was there. Quite. I nodded, as Dumbledore. Professor Dumbledore. I rolled my eyes while I left her hands and took a step back, as Albie made me notice recently. I am a 13-year-old wizard, and the world can hardly conceive of leaving me to my devices for all the time that I spend outside the castle. Minerva huffed exasperately, my brothers may be only children now, and you've always been unusually mature, but I can see why nobody would think it wise to leave a kid on his own. Ah, I pointed a finger in her direction, but you know me, I need my space, something that I didn't feel like risking by informing any adult about my condition. And after a second, I added. Besides, if nobody knows I'm the only one to live where I do, the magic cast there is, of course, thought to be cast by the adult on the premises. Her eyes widened while her lips twitched in a strange manner, as if warring between laughter and worry while her hands went to her hips and she leveled her green gaze at me like it was the point of a wand. You're telling me, that not only you're without supervision for the entirety of the holidays, but that you also cast magic unsupervised in your home. I didn't bother hiding my grin while I sat once more in my large armchair. Well, I spend most of my free time traveling, the magic I cast unsupervised is more or less anywhere, really. Before Minerva could use her deductive skills to link together my being unsupervised with my research on how to heal lycanthropy, I brandished my wand, and tried something that I had only theorized about. I knew fire, I understood it in a way that left my comprehension of potion making far behind. It was more primal, it spoke with a depth that nothing else I had found until now could match. Some familiarity with fire was fundamental in any charm, and it lent itself extraordinarily well to channeling directly will and meaning. As I had mentioned to Minerva, I had met Fawkes, the immortal firebird. I might have been a bit loose-tongued because of the brew I had drunk to show off to Orion Black, but I remembered that I had also, following some instinct that I would now kick myself in the shins for, doubted. After all, the wand chooses the wizard, and the holly wand I held chose me, when its twin rested in the hands of Riddle himself. I remembered my decision in Ollivander's, to change the world for the better, while not concerning myself on preconceived or imposed limits of any kind. Still, I hadn't killed Tom yet, and for all the danger he presented, for all the idle thoughts and half-hearted planning, I really didn't want to. He was brilliant in a way that left me speechless, and while I was careful about not letting him ensnare me in any kind of plot, I knew that he understood. He looked at my notes and discerned the meaning behind them, he talked with me about magic and I caught his implications, we spoke exactly once about the history of the magical world we lived in, and our hypotheses fed off each other until we had a cohesive picture of events supported by an inescapable logic. For all of my dreams for the future, it was hard for me to not imagine Tom doing the same, there was just so much he could give, that killing him, without even considering the terrible possibility of failing to do so, which would, of course, do nothing but cause retaliation on his part that would devolve in an endless war between the two of us. I didn't want to kill Riddle. And I had, a bit woozy because of what I had drunk, asked Fawkes to find another to oppose him. Since nothing in my new lease of life seemed easy, the Phoenix had refused. Of fucking course. Still, I closed my eyes and I ignored Minerva asking me what I was attempting, letting my mind drift while my body tried to recall the feel of flames, and my magic simmered as if a flame itself, just as had once happened at Ollivander's. A brief, soft tongue of golden flame sprouted from the tip of my wand, and I could hear an undefinable echo in the distance. When I opened my eyes, there wasn't Fawkes appearing in a gout of flame, only Minerva staring at me with a somewhat distant look in her eyes. What was that? One of the things I couldn't do under adult supervision. I retorted cheekily just as the double doors of the Runda opened, letting Tom stride in with his usual, refined grace. Riddle. I greeted him, emboldened by the faint memory of Phoenix's song that I had managed to summon. Even if I would have appreciated much more Fawkes actually answering to my call. Hagrid, he replied blandly only to turn towards Minerva and assume a much more civil tone. Minerva, how do you fare? Quite well, Tom, thank you. She smiled back while she walked towards the doors, pride swelling on her face like a second skin while she admired her own work. We were talking about Professor Dumbledore's Phoenix. I wouldn't say that Fawkes belongs to anyone. I commented, my attention returning to Riddle as he fished out a leather-bound journal and my hairs stood on end for a second. Only for me to relax when I noticed that it was some nondescript brown leather. That's not the diary, okay? In order to cover my instinctive reaction, I kept talking, immediately pointing at one topic that, thanks to the diadem, I chose to face. Imagine that, I met the Phoenix when I was in detention. Not such a horrible detention then. Riddle didn't even hesitate as he flipped through his journal. I'm aware of your excessive fascination with creatures of any sort. Yes, well, I stepped forward until I was close enough to loom over Tom. Imagine my irritation when I had to dispatch some fools that attempted to ambush me to soothe their wounded pride, eager to confirm their place in the world by attempting to push me to the bottom. Riddle raised his face so that our eyes met. Neither of us resorted to legilimency, it wasn't needed. His carefully blank face told me all I needed to know. He of course knew of the plans of those idiots, and he didn't care in the slightest. Do you know why avalanches are unpredictable, Tom? I chose to use his given name to annoy him more than anything else, and before he could reply, I answered my own question. Because nobody can ever know which snowflake will be the one to tip the scales. Chapter 59, Harry Potter, Chapter 58, Snowflakes 3. Do you know why avalanches are unpredictable, Tom? I chose to use his given name to annoy him more than anything else, and before he could reply, I answered my own question. Because nobody can ever know which snowflake will be the one to tip the scales. After a second that stretched heavily between us, a second during which Riddle undoubtedly understood perfectly where I was getting at, Minerva returned from her inspection of the marvel that was the main entrance of the Runda. What is this? Her eyes peered curiously from my left at the open pages of Tom's journal, which hosted a sequence of extremely precise drawings in black ink of a multitude of objects, a chair, a stack of bound notes, an unlit torch, and so on. With a soft, practiced smile that hid the tension between us with enviable ease, Tom took a step back and touched with his wand one of the drawings, with a brief arch of his length of yew and phoenix feather. the ink rose from the page and the blank spaces immediately began to take in their natural color. A split second later, in a flutter of events too tightly packed to be witnessed, in a manner that reminded me strongly of the animagook transformation, there was a chair placed beside Riddle. With a satisfied smile, he sat on that. What do you think? Minerva almost shouted in glee at the sudden demonstration. You didn't conjure the chair, she stated with certainty, while my eyes zeroed in on the journal in his hands and I tried to find a link of some sort among the objects drawn in there. And so began the informal game that we had going on. Every time one of us showed off something new, the creator kept quiet, letting the other two attempt to figure out the vague outline of the magic behind the new marvel. You don't have? I don't know, a lighthouse inside that journal, do you? I asked after a few seconds. As if our previous, quiet confrontation never took place, Tom smiled slightly and simply shook his head, his lips closed as he refused to give even the smallest hint. You used the method of enchanting something in its new shape to pin in place the change without losing the previous properties, didn't you? Minerva had never been accused of not being fast on the uptake, and with her green eyes gleaming with interest, I was reminded once more of her feline form. Well, wands are only a way to cast magic, I mumbled as I expanded my train of thought. I guess it was a long-winded series of enchantments that allowed you to create this marvel, both on the ink, and the objects that you somewhat turned into drawings. Have you considered what could you do with the blood of a chimera mixed with the ink? Tom blinked as he suddenly considered the option. You'd leverage the multi-faced properties of a creature composed like a puzzle to make the ink more adaptable. I shrugged while I nodded. Something like that. Rituals are like potions on a larger scale, but I'd have to know the actual process to make an informed hypothesis. Without batting an eye, Tom once more used his wand to fish from his leather-bound journal, extracting a thick roll of parchment that he offered me with a superior smirk. Be my guest. I immediately walked over to my table and unrolled the treasure that Riddle just offered, my eyes positively devouring the contents while I grabbed a blank parchment and began to scribble notes on it. There was a little of everything in this particular piece of magic. Tom had a way of thinking that didn't match mine all that often, but the more important parts needed to build this enchantment were explored distinctly. A bit of the protean charm, some theory of switching spells, of course, enchantments on the ink that has to be applied to the objects. My eyes hadn't betrayed me when I thought of the animagus transformation when I observed the chair transition from a drawing to the real deal, only for my eyes to rise from what I was reading while I made an actual question. Only you can put stuff in and out using that particular ink, can't you? Tom nodded, clearly never even considering how useful it could be to send something the size of a chair through owl post. I had to craft everything, from the journal to the ink. My focus returned to the parchment while Minerva pulled from one of her pockets the black king that she had kept since her creation of the doors, handing it over to Tom with a roll of her eyes. Well deserved, I think, unless Rubeus has something to show us. I shook my head while I took in the part of the notes that explained how the ink had to be bound with each of the objects meant to be transferred on parchment. Is this how the dark mark was born? And just as I thought about it, I imagined another thing. Could you store your wand as a tattoo? Of course, Tom already had an answer, because even he, in his conceited and sadly often earned superiority, had considered how useful it could be to always have your wand with you. Human skin isn't stable enough to hold an object, the body would take the addiction as some sort of malady, or invasion. I can't imagine the effects on mind or magic. I hummed thoughtfully, not quite convinced. This particular method didn't work with human skin as a conduit, but I wasn't fully human, was I? And couldn't I attempt a metamorphosis through a ritual of sorts? This wasn't living magic, so there would be no need for an outrageous sacrifice. There were options that deserved to be explored, that was sure. Then another idea popped up in my mind, and I rose my eyes to see Minerva approaching me to observe Riddle's notes from the side, in that passive-aggressive impatient attitude of hers, while Tom twirled the Black King in his hand with a self-satisfied smile. I'm nearing a dead end on my research for a cure. I didn't specify a cure for what. Both knew what I was talking about. Myth says that Lycaon was the first to be cursed by the gods, and that happened in Greece. It's our good fortune that chimeras are also native of that region. What do you say to a summer hunting trip? Minerva's lips thinned. You can't have possibly suggested that we, all underage, move about Europe during wartime. I shrugged while my eyes remained fixed on Tom. I never had a problem with that. The trace spots underage wizards only in Muggle areas, because the Ministry knows where they live. We merely have to keep to the wilderness, which coincidentally is where we might find a chimera to study. And aren't you already 17? Tom spoke idly as a frown appeared on his features, a sign that he was thinking furiously despite his calm tone. The opportunity of not being in London for the entirety of the summer clearly interested him. You were planning on taking the apparition exam this spring, weren't you? You're 17. I blinked owlishly at the slightly annoyed expression on the witch's face. I was born the 4th of October, she sniffed. I've been of age for a while. Then we'll use this expedition to figure out a proper present for your majority. I clapped my hands excitedly. I'll need to learn how to render magical creatures if we're pushed into defending ourselves. Tom rose from his chair and returned it to his leather-bound journal with another tight arc described by his U-wand. We might as well start opening some personal accounts in Gringotts. Thanks to Professor Slughorn, I heard that with the war many esoteric ingredients have been restricted, and when they reach the market they're never as fresh as they should be. I can figure out a potion for preserving anything under the sunday. I nodded, grabbing another piece of parchment and starting a list. How eager must he be? He never allowed himself to be seen like this. There was an excited gleam into Tom's eyes as he walked over to me and started to observe my list. My trick won't be adequate for transportation of massive things, parts of creatures included. I could transport empty jars, however. You're all assuming that I agree with this madness. Minerva jumped in, her arms crossed in a way that suggested she was trying to hold herself back. I have my N.E.W.T.S next year. This summer I might be introduced to Flamel himself, and I have to help around a bit at home. I cannot simply go gallivanting. It will be a couple of weeks in the worst-case scenario, Minerva. Tom smoothly interceded. I'm not sure I'm able to apparate while bringing other people in tow. She objected. Besides, we're talking about Greece. It's not exactly behind the corner. I've built a shack near the Alps. How difficult could it be to port Kea there? I asked honestly. Maybe I'll ask Orion. He has a knack for charms. Maybe a small rowboat? We can enlarge it once we're there and follow the coast if we cross Italy. Tom raised another point that I added to the list, already thinking about how I could tweak the potions I used to build my shacks so that our hypothetical ship would be adequate for the travel. Don't ignore me. Minerva, I can see that you're interested. I rolled my eyes. You're a born hunter, as your other form suggests. You've objected, and if something happens, it will be our fault. Of course, a group of 3 is much safer than one of 2. And you'd be able to keep an eye on us if you came along. Riddle was, as always, an extraordinary manipulator. Of course, Minerva had managed to grow wise to his most blatant attempts, and so she took a deep breath to berate him. Besides, I've been operating since my first year. I dropped the news like the bomb they were, and I luxuriated in the outraged glances I received. What, did you think I walked to the Alps? Please. I wanted to scoff, but my mind returned to the potential of ingredients that were the result of a hunt I was a part of. I could use them to actually empower the hunting ritual I was experimenting with in order to push the werewolves beyond their cursed state. And what more? Ignoring the human sacrifice, there was no reason why a magical creature couldn't be turned into something else. Tom mentioned a boat, did he not? I need to research kelpies. I added that to the top of my list. Didn't Dumbledore come to Hogwarts for the Triwizard through a magical ship? That had clearly been able to transport living people across a great distance. I didn't miss the sudden interest that Tom displayed while Minerva spluttered indignantly because of how we more or less coerced her into coming with us. Yes, I thought to myself as we kept going over the logistics of a theoretical voyage that had to be kept under wraps, and I felt a familiar excitement rise in me like an infinite wave. This will be fun. Chapter 60, Harry Potter, Chapter 59, On the Prowl I. Wingardium Leviosa. I found some solace in using the basic charm as it was meant to be used. For the first time in what felt like decades, that single piece of magic was merely meant to hold up something of limited dimensions for a limited amount of time. Under the light of the fading sunset, I observed with trepidation the flat disk of iron etched with Norse runes. It had taken me a couple of weeks of research to properly prepare. And I could only be thankful that the Norse had already been using a seal composed by this many runes for a purpose that so closely matched my own, otherwise I would have needed to start from scrap. For the first time since I first talked about ancient runes with Tom, I appreciated why they were still so used. In theory, enchantments were simply effects added more or less permanently to any given object thanks to a wizard imposing its will on it. That was it. The use of symbols was meant to be only in the head of the caster, as they acted as bridges between meaning and reality, but they were unnecessary if one was capable enough. And I was capable enough. At least, I was capable enough when it came to leveraging the understanding of a single meaning. I could turn myself into something unimportant by lifting my shadow and donning it as a cloak. Technically that was a temporary enchantment on an object, which fell under the charm category that Hogwarts and the magical world at large was so fixated on. But for what I had planned, I had to make sure that every element was present at the same time. For what I needed, I had to be certain that several meanings that I used to tweak reality would mesh well with each other, and not fade while my mind stopped focusing completely on them. Maybe, if I had been still and meditating, I might have been able to keep up the multiple meanings that powered the magic I was attempting to weave, but that wasn't the case. The disc of flat iron hovered silently in front of me, and I went over each symbol before beginning this new experiment. Mere potions and ritualism applied to the hunt appeared to not be enough to heal the werewolves. I had tried unsuccessfully for months. This would be something new, something that hopefully could bind the success of the hunt with the condition necessary to satisfy the mad craving of the werewolf. As I had figured out, pushing against the curse simply didn't work. What was needed was a catharsis of sort, something that would satisfy the beast, enough to allow the humanity to resurface. Fio to begin the seal, my wand tapped the symbol, which lit with a perfect white. Canaz to find the prey, and the symbol followed the fate of the previous one. I was that is the hunting itself, the seeking of success. I breathed slowly as the eye had carved in the bone lit up, and then went on, Rado for the travel that we'll have to complete. The symbol lit, and I felt the disc of bone thrum with the promise of the seal I was building, and then I completed the seal by tapping, Euros for the strength I'll need and prove to have. I had downed my potions, I had modified those for Marie and Paul, and cast a significant engorgo over the wild boar that snorted irritably in his wooden cage. A full regime of brews had gone into making him more dangerous, faster, more resilient, and if I managed it correctly, even smarter. While I kept an eye on the others, I secured the iron seal on my shirt with a simple sticking charm. I didn't feel anything more than the thrumming eagerness that the potions had already imbued me with. I could only hope that this hunt would be the last. The tusks of the horse-sized boar scratched deep gouges in the wood of its cage, and the bars groaned in protest when the creature leaned on them with its bulk, but its prison held. Paul, his mind a chaotic mess of resentment and fear, drank his vial. Marie, who on the other hand seemed to face each transformation with the acceptance of the martyr, did the same. I cloaked myself in shadows, crouched behind a tree, my body looking like a misshapen stretch of unimportant darkness among the roots and the underbrush, and the full moon shone over the horizon, the slowly dying light of the June sunset retreating in front of she who called the hunt. In response to the moonlight, the muggles I had saved years before shifted, in a rictus of agony, their bones broke, their ligaments tore, their muscles were shredded as they assumed a new, corded might, greyish fur sprouted from skin that assumed the consistency of hide, and the eyes of Paul and Marie mirrored the loose of sanity that heralded the coming of the cursed wolf. The cage of the magically enhanced boar gave with a snapping of wood, and an instant later we were rocketing through the little underbrush that characterized the forest of Dean. I passed by trees while I contorted with a flexibility that only my bruise could gift me. My feet made no sound as I moved over the occasional twig, and the smell of my sweat and breath didn't leave my skin, kept in place by the mantle of shadows that surrounded me for the duration of the hunt. Ahead of the two werewolves, the giant boar tore uncaringly across the forest, trees splintering against his unforgiving tusks and the few rocks cracking under the might of its legs, powerful muscles moving in waves under the hirsute hair that covered the creature. With the occasional howl and snarl, Paul and Marie, or the two cursed, mindless beasts that had taken their place, streaked under the stretches of moonlight that pierced the open canopy above us, their golden eyes shining in the dark with the bloodlust singing in them. The hunt was the solution to my impasse when it came to curing lycanthropy, I was sure of it. So I kept up the rear, observing what little I could of the werewolves ahead of me, using my ears more than my eyes to follow the boar that led the strange charge through the forest of Dean, and I made a mental note of dropping some potions to help the trees heal once the moon returned beneath the horizon. Eventually, I reached Paul and Marie, who hadn't yet killed the boar. Instead, the creature had decided that turning on itself and trying to gore one of its hinters was the best idea ever. With its back to an oak large enough to prevent any of the two werewolves from circling it, the prey shook its massive head threateningly, with its tusks digging once more against the ground. I quickly and silently climbed a tree and observed the results of my meddling, the iron disc etched with runes feeling strangely heavy against my chest. Even through my shirt, it felt cold. Not now. I wrenched my focus back on the werewolves that had moved while I was busy climbing. Paul, that I recognized as its bulk was bigger than Marie's, had a shallow but long scratch that went from the shoulder to the hip. Apparently, he had tried to duck under the charge of the boar, and my eyes spotted the much deeper gnash on the prey's foreleg, signifying some measure of success. The boar shook its head and its tusks dug deep grooves in the ground, dirt and grass flying about in a small cloud as the creature snorted angrily, only to charge once more. Marie nimbly avoided it, remaining close enough to force the prey to keep its focus on her, just in time for Paul to jump over the back of the horse-sized herbivore, its razor-sharp teeth piercing the thick hide as if it wasn't even there, its claw tearing into the muscles and sinew below. From then on, it was a matter of time. Marie kept darting in only to retreat from the dangerous tusks of the boar, which were used to great effect to guard its throat, while Paul bit and snarled and clawed and howled. The panicked prey darted forth once more, uprooting a couple of trees in the vain hope of dislodging the werewolf on its back, while the smaller of the two cursed beings ripped a chunk of flesh from its rear. The boar buckled, and soon the copious blood loss slowed its reactions. Soon, it died. The potion enhancing me stopped working with the death of the creature, and I held my breath as Marie and Paul feasted on the horse-sized boar. Once they consumed their victory, so to speak, the curse should recede, either leaving both in human form, or returning their human minds to the pilot seat. For all of the immense dimensions of the boar, it didn't take the two werewolves more than an hour to leave behind only bones that had been gnawed upon. It was a gruesome sight, and not something that I cared to observe any more than necessary. I remained concealed while they finished, and I waited with bared teeth to observe a change, even minuscule, in the behavior of Paul and Marie. Pacified somewhat, the werewolves eventually left the clearing created by the fierce battle among the creatures, and once they slinked away in the night in different directions, I held back the instinct of punching the nearest branch out of frustration. They no longer howled and snarled madly, but that was hardly an acceptable proof that I had managed what I had set myself out to do. Maybe I can use the bones of the boar for something, I thought to myself as I started to quietly descend from my hiding spot. A hunting horn carved from one of the tusks of prey killed by a werewolf could be useful, couldn't it? Enchanting wasn't my forte, but I might figure out a small ritual or unique brew to turn the tusk into something more. As Dumbledore would one day say, music is its own form of magic. The how was representative of the werewolves hunting, and maybe I'd find a way. In any case, I wasn't one to waste potential resources, even if I was done with exploiting the dying. I cast aside the guilt-bearing memory of the death of my father and made my way through the newly made clearing. I raised my wand, ready to start pulling apart the potentially useful tusks from the bloodied and gnawed skull of the boar, when I heard something. Chapter 61, Harry Potter, Chapter 60, On the Prowl 2. I cast aside the guilt-bearing memory of the death of my father and made my way through the newly made clearing. I raised my wand, ready to start pulling apart the potentially useful tusks from the bloodied and gnawed skull of the boar, when I heard something. I didn't wait to identify the sound, I didn't turn to get visual confirmation, I threw myself to the side, grunting in pain when I felt twin lines of fire trace themselves from my shoulder to the middle of my back. The thin shirt I had on didn't provide the faintest protection from the attacker, and while I rolled on the ground, I blasted everything in my immediate surroundings. I had been about to cast some magic, but I had already been in the mindset I used to manipulate reality without need for wand movements or incantations. The primal push of fear thundered across me, and beyond me, everything was thrown away. The more or less devoured corpse of the giant boar rolled over a couple of times, the effects of the potions that I had fed it during the previous month lingering even now that it was dead, granting it some measure of resilience that went beyond what could be given merely by its bulk. The nearest trees buckled under the pressure, their trunks groaning menacingly as the bark splintered, and the werewolf that had assaulted me was pushed back violently. I spotted him as a grey streak under the moonlight. The larger of the two werewolves I had been attempting to cure was already bounding towards me, a mad snarl rumbling from its open maw and the ground giving under its claws. Once again pushed by the sudden fear that dominated me, I slashed with my wand, and a weaker version of the blasting charm slowed the creature, just to give me time to rise fully to my feet, and to summon towards me the carcass of the boar. The physical obstacle cracked under the clawing of the werewolf, and after a deep breath, I fished out a potion from my satchel, my eyes darting about in fear of the other cursed being that could be waiting in the darkness of the trees. The moonlight glinted on the vial I threw towards the still levitating carcass that I was keeping interposed between me and the crazed werewolf, thankfully unable to think properly, otherwise, he'd have simply circled around. I pushed once more, jabbing my wand forward while I took a step forward, my body echoing the intention of my mind and the purpose of my magic as I maintained my improvised defense, only to follow up with a sweeping motion. From the sides of the clearing, countless broken branches followed my command and jabbed themselves into the bloodied carcass of the boar, just as the vial broke and spilled the murky green contents over the mess that I was keeping between me and the werewolf. Following the same instinct that had made me animate a tree years before, I seared my fright and the rage it summoned into the carcass of the boar. The branches came together, binding themselves to the skeleton underneath them thanks to my potion, and the dead boar moved in a parody of the life that had allowed him to run through the forest. Bewildered, I stilled as the creature shook its head, its tusks scraping against the claws of the werewolf that snarled in outrage and backed off. I immediately moved to keep the enraged construct between me and Paul. The golden glint in his eyes spoke only of madness, and I felt myself baring my teeth as an answer. I lobbed forth a small bolt of fire that was meant to distract more than cause harm, and as the werewolf darted to the side, the unholy construct that was already coming apart under the multitude of effects that operated upon the boar's carcass moved with a deceptive speed. The left tusk that had made an easy work of most of the forest's undergrowth and many of its trees gored the cursed wolf, and charged along with it against the nearest tree. By chance, that oak managed to resist the immense force that was being exercised, and while the werewolf snarled through the waterfall of blood that fell from its maw, I changed reality in a pattern that I preferred once more. The lowest branch broke off from the trunk and fell across the nape of my target, stunning it while the boar reared back, dislodging Paul before charging forward once more. Only then I noticed that there was something wrong. What the hell am I doing? As I scrambled to find a safe way to intervene, as I didn't want Paul to die, the reanimated boar fell apart, but not before nailing the werewolf once more to the oak, this time with its right tusk. Under the many effects of the potions and enchantments that made it the size of a horse and capable of many other things, under the pressure of my animation that wanted to keep the original prey as a single creature pushing against the impulse of growth that soaked the tree branches that had taken the place of corded muscles and flesh. The boar finally stilled, my magic abandoning it as the tree branches weaved together and broke through its bones, feeding off the marrow within to stretch themselves towards the sky only to wither and die as they didn't find enough to live out of. A cynical part of my mind reminded me of when I had fantasized about creating a Venusaur, years before, while the rest of myself was staring at the werewolf nailed to the oak tree that dominated the half-destroyed clearing. Paul was dead. Through what was left of my shirt, I felt the cold heaviness of the iron disc etched with runes that should have all but guaranteed a more positive ending to this hunt, and I felt nauseous. Not again. I had rescued Paul with the precise intent of healing him, of not leaving him and Marie to fend for themselves in a Muggle France ravaged by war. I had experimented endlessly on both of them with the express purpose of one day freeing them from the curse that had plagued humanity for uncountable centuries. I clenched my hand around my wand while my other one went to the seal hanging on the iron disc sticking on what remained of my shirt. But before I could wrap my head around the events of the night, from my left, the other werewolf prowled out of the shadows cast by the trees. The moon lit the grey of her fur and glinted viciously off her bared fangs. With a sudden bout of clarity, I realized that I was an idiot. I spun on myself and operated away. The world compressed me and it felt as if I was being sucked through a cement straw, darkness as always closing on me while I resisted with practiced ease to the stress of the teleportation magic. But as I pushed forward, something pulled back. An agonized scream tore itself free from my throat while I managed to avoid failing my apparition. I pushed until something gave, and I landed in a sprawled mess not far from the shadow ash tree that warded my house, and a burning, throbbing pain seized me. From my side there was a huge chunk of flesh missing. My vision swam and I remained on the ground, unable to move. My muscles spasmed angrily and out of my control as the pain made my vision go black for a few seconds. In the clutches of pain, I held onto my wand and pushed everything around me like I had done in the clearing, and I hear a metallic snap. As sight returned to me, I spotted the iron seal that I had stuck to my shirt broken by my side. But still, my body didn't answer my commands, and I was beginning to feel lightheaded because of the blood loss. If only I could reach my satchel. I had everything I needed there, but it might as well been on the moon. My body refused to answer. I buried my instinctive reactions while I attempted to clear my mind. I gritted my teeth through the unimaginable pain, and focused instead on the wand that I was still clutching in my hand. With something like desperation pushing me, I managed to recall the feel of flames, and my magic simmered as if a flame itself while I tried one last time what was my last hope. I lost consciousness while I believed that the sun suddenly blossomed over my head in a rushing, warm wind colored by orange and golden flames. Chapter 62, Harry Potter, Chapter 61, On the Prowl 3. The night was mostly quiet and without wind. The smoke from the factories coupled with the persistent smog of the cars clogged the air despite the rain of the previous afternoon, and Tom Riddle hated London a bit more just for that. The air at Hogwarts carried with it the cool resilience of the stone walls, the faint smoke of burning wood, the multitude of simmering potions, and the infinite rustle of the forbidden forest singing in tune with the faint waves of the Black Lake. The Slytherin wizard was sprawled on the uncomfortable mattress of the room that he managed to coerce Mrs. Cole into leaving aside only for him. his U-wand cradled in his fingers and his dark eyes peering through half-lidded eyes at the dingy wallpaper and the slightly rusted hinges of the only window that allowed him to spot the full moon barely hidden by the occasional stretch of clouds. Once more, he had been forced by circumstance into returning to the orphanage. Once more, he had been cut from his true home, from his birthright. For another summer, he'd be more or less held hostage among the filthy muggles, risking his life merely by living in London. For 8 months the Luftwaffe had dropped bombs on strategic cities across Britain. Oh, Riddle had been at Hogwarts between the 7th of September and the days of May during which the Blitz was conducted, but when he returned, he had seen the devastation and had seen the fear in the minds of those who surrounded him. The entirely reasonable fear of disappearing in a ball of fire during the night, with warnings that weren't enough to protect the abandoned orphans at Wool's. And he had felt that very same fear. He learned fast. Magic was his way out of the pale and meaningless world of the Muggles, and he was rightly bright at it. Wasn't he the heir of Slytherin? But he couldn't have defended himself at the time, not if the building he was in was destroyed in a split second while he was still asleep. Not that sleep could ever reach him in a world that wasn't his. Each summer, he had been forced back into his personal slice of hell, remaining awake every night in fear that he'd open his eyes only to lose them to fire and shrapnel. There wasn't a comfortable bed in the safety of the dungeons beneath the Black Lake. There was no vast amount of food available 3 times a day, and worst of all, there wasn't magic. Tom learned to steal naps during the day every time he could, and he had slowly managed to push his way into Mrs. Cole's out of sight, out of mind mindset, to the point that he was exonerated from the duties that the other orphans had to complete. To the point that everyone was grateful, if a bit envious in the case of the more stupid children, to have him keep to himself to his room. He could only read those tomes he managed to take from his true home, and wait, counting the months and weeks and days and hours and minutes until he'd finally be able to return to his rightful place. The bombings had apparently stopped, but who was to say that it wasn't a simple strategy to have everyone lower their guard until it was too late? Well, Tom wouldn't fall for it. He couldn't. He'd live forever, and that meant not sleeping while in the Muggle world. How absurd it was that Hagrid already knew how to apparate, how insane it was that he apparently did so on the regular and hadn't been spotted by the Ministry. Oh, Tom hadn't wasted time in having the theory explained to him, but the intolerable part was that the theory was limited to willing it along with some absolutely inconceivable motto that the fools at school truly believed in. Destination, deliberation, determination? How ridiculous, how laughable. But the only thing worse than being unable to apparate with Hagrid's ease because of his disregard for the Ministry's method, would be to succeed in escaping the Muggle world only to splint himself and scatter his pieces across the land. Tom couldn't die, and so he couldn't attempt apparition on his own. Too risky, too dangerous. Too unacceptable because it meant simply following the word of Hagrid even above Minerva's description of the classes. So Tom waited in his bed, his eyes half-lidded as he resorted to occlumency to keep himself from fidgeting. He'd wait. Soon enough, he'd travel to the continent, in some crazy adventure that nonetheless allowed him his much sought-after freedom. For the first time in his life, he wouldn't be constrained to the Muggle world, and he was sure that Minerva could teach how to apparate properly. For that sole reason, he'd have agreed to reach Australia. Greece was a surprisingly tame destination, and the possibility of hunting a chimera, as Hagrid had not so subtly hinted at, roused his interest. After all, he was hardly challenged at school, and he could hardly make use of the many spells that had laid forgotten in the restricted section or in the Chamber of Secrets until he rediscovered them. So Tom waited, the many sounds of a half-asleep London trickling through the opened window and pushing against the odd noises that everyone had to grow familiar with in an orphanage. He waited, and under the reinforced calm of his occlumency, he could only feel eagerness. Soon, he could leave behind the orphanage, and the witless, meaningless muggles that surrounded him. Soon he would no longer need to forcefully hold back sleep to avoid nightmares of. With the crackling of fire, a fiery flash appeared in the center of Tom's small room, immediately followed by a dull thud against the floor, and the oddest echo of a song he couldn't place ringing in the Slytherin's ears. Tom was already on his feet with his wand raised above him to cast the most powerful shield he could conjure, his heart hammering in his chest as he felt the fears of years bubbling to the surface despite his occlumency, only for it all to freeze when his extraordinary brain parsed the information that his eyes conveyed. In a growing pool of blood on his floor, there was a face-down Hagrid, his shirt ripped to tatters as 2 thin cuts across his back ended with a chunk of flesh outright missing. The red liquid immediately filled the room with its coppery tang while it shone wetly under the light of the moon. Despite himself, Riddle found himself kneeling at the side of the unnaturally sized wizard, ignoring the blood that almost splashed against his bare knees while he whispered harshly, as it wouldn't do to awaken the muggles only for them to find the unexplainable presence of Rubeus in his room in the middle of the night. "Hagrid! Are you awake?" The dark eyes of the younger wizard opened a fraction despite the pained grimace on his face, and with a voice that was less than the barest whisper, he spoke, "SS Satchel." Forcing himself to hold back the questions while his mind put together the context with the word used by the heavily wounded Slytherin student, Tom quickly grabbed the satchel that hung on Rubeus' waist, opening it and immediately grabbing the vials labeled Essence of Dittany. Thanking the moonlight in the privacy of his mind, Riddle immediately poured a generous dose of the contents of the greatest wound first, who went as stiff as a plank of wood when the liquid sizzled and forcefully stopped the bleeding. As he proceeded to repeat the action over the parallel cuts that went from Hagrid's left shoulder to just over the middle of his back, he noticed that Rubeus was already shaking his head. Once more in what amounted to less than a whisper, the younger wizard spoke. Silver potion, then, drawing strength from the slightly waning pain from the missing chunk of flesh on his right side, he spoke a bit more clearly, after that, blood replenishing. Tom set to follow his instructions without questioning him, as he clearly wasn't in a position to explain himself at the moment, and at the same time, he already began thinking of a way to smuggle the insanely huge wizard out of the orphanage before the dawn came, along with the difficulties implicit in cleaning the blood from the old floor and his own clothes. Of course, you wouldn't bother with labeling your experimental brews even when they turn out to be extremely important. Riddle huffed as he kept a few vials he fished from the small satchel under the moonlight until he recognized the needed ones. While he worked and managed to make the wounds on Rubeus' back stop bleeding, he handed him the blood replenishing potion, which had no doubt been heavily modified to be insanely more effective than anything ever seen before. With halting movements, the much bigger wizard uncorked the vial and downed the entirety of its contents, only to rest his head once more on the floor, his eyes closing tiredly as he waited for all of his potions to take effect. Now that his sudden bout of fear had had time to abate, and the absurdity of the current situation no longer occupied the entirety of his cognitive functions, Riddle began to grow aggravated with Hagrid. It wasn't enough that he'd annoy him by spotting his minimal influence over certain idiots at school, oh no, he had to bother him even during the summer. At least the Ministry had apparently neglected to spot the humongous, underage, wounded wizard appearing in a literal ball of fire in a Muggle orphanage. Still, Riddle had apparently just saved Hagrid's life, which meant that he owed him, and he owed him a lot. Thinking about what he had recently discovered about the unnaturally tall Slytherin student, Tom poked at the wound in Rubeus' side, forcing him to jolt on the floor with a hiss. "Awaken, you big lump! You cannot stay on the floor of a Muggle orphanage. And how did you manage to find me?" Hagrid blinked slowly as he breathed through gritted teeth. Slowly, he managed to turn on one side, and then on his back, even if that meant that his shoulder pressed uncomfortably against one wall of the now cramped room. "Tom? What are you doing here?" "I live here." Riddle wasn't going to let the other play him for a fool. "You, on the other hand, almost broke the statute of secrecy, completely shredded the reasonable restriction over the use of magic for underage wizards, and woke me by appearing half-dead in my room in a ball of fire, and..." Hagrid rose a hand to stop the extremely pointed tirade of the older student, his eyes closed while brow furrowed, and he undoubtedly went over the events that had caused his appearance, surely censuring them as much as he could before giving an answer. "Long story," he rasped out, "thanks for the help." Riddle fought the sudden urge of smacking the much bigger boy. "You're not going to get away with it with a long story, Hagrid," he observed pointedly. "I want answers." The other simply rolled his eyes, slowly shifting his weight to his arms as he managed to put himself on a seated position. "No, I'm serious, I'll tell you, but not tonight. Am I in London?" "Of course, you imbecile." Rubeus took a deep breath, apparently checking himself under the moonlight while his fingers grasped his wand once more and half-heartedly attempted to clean it from the dried blood. "I'll take the night bus and spend the night in Diagon Alley, until I recover enough to apparate." "And my explanation?" Riddle asked sardonically while he ripped the bedsheet that covered his mattress and used it to roughly clean his knees from the other wizard's blood. "Never mind, I'll get it soon enough. I just saved your life, didn't I?" Rubeus took another, tired deep breath. "Let's skip this part. What do you want?" "Take me away from London." "What?" Rubeus straightened his back while he manually put away the empty vials and his wand. Tom sat on his bed and threw the dirty bedsheet at Rubeus only to hunch forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You heard me. Well, the trip to Greece isn't scheduled for a while yet." "Oh, no, I didn't mean only for this summer, I meant away from the orphanage, period." Riddle grinned, and it was a joyless thing, but something that screamed of triumph nevertheless, as you undoubtedly understood. The grimace on Hagrid's face seemed to seep down into his very soul, and that alone was almost worth the fright and the disturbance that the other Slytherin had brought into Tom's life. Then he chuckled, seeming genuinely amused. You know, normal people at least pretend to care about the saving part, instead of the reward. Hell, some of them only help because they can. You must know normal people that I don't then. Riddle replied blandly. How cynic. The two waited for a few seconds during which the silence stretched awkwardly, at least on one side, until Rubeus finally nodded. It'll take me a few days to organize things. Tom remembered that he still had the Black King after the last piece of magic he displayed in the Runda, but he knew that if that wasn't the case, he would have earned it that night. Now, they only had to figure out a way to smuggle the unnaturally tall Slytherin student out of Wool's, and a manner to clean the blood on the floor before any muggle spotted it. Chapter 63, Harry Potter, Chapter 62, Courting Danger I. The sun described a strange pattern with the shadows cast by the trees across the ground, while the breeze made the grass sway lightly. Marie sat in a wicker chair placed on a stretch of green grass, huddled in clothes that hung slightly too large on her frame as he stared dully forward. Under a cypress tree that wasn't there the day before, just at the edge of the forest, there was a rectangular slab of stone nestled among the roots. Paul d'Auboville. She read the name on the tombstone with a hollow voice, as well as the dates that contained the entirety of his life between the years 1910 and 1943. It seemed ridiculous that something as absurd as becoming a werewolf, and following changes brought in his life, could be squeezed into a handful of years. Maybe he'd have hated to be buried on foreign soil, Marie would never know. It had been difficult to believe. From the existence of magic, to the fact that clearly not all wizards or witches were demons, to the much more real and painfully presence of lycanthropy. It had been difficult to believe. It still was, in many ways, but it couldn't be denied. Marie let out a shuddering breath as her eyes didn't move from the tombstone, her mind far away as she tried to make a sense of her life. Would she too die with no warning at the next full moon? Would she go mad and remain as the monster she held within forevermore? The beast that she could feel clawing just under her ribs in the days before the full moon? The part of her that loved meat that had barely been cooked, the part that made her head whip about when her nose picked up some scent she didn't recognize on the air? Paul had almost never been an easy man to be around. He was rough, uncaring, and felt like the world owed him for the disaster that his life had become. But he had been there, he had been with her when the monsters like she was now, attacked in the night. He had tried to fight back despite the paralyzing terror. And more importantly, he had been there through all that followed. With every full moon, they had shared agony and helplessness. With every new moon, they faced anew the terrible reality of their situation along with the lingering pain of the transformation. And with every discussion that got somewhat heated, as sharing such a big house with Paul had never been a cakewalk, they had shared the beast within stirring viciously. Would anyone care if, with the next full moon, she died too? Would it matter? More to the point, did Marie herself care about it? It wasn't like she had something to live for. Her life had ended in France, and whatever came later had only been an eternal purgatory. She hugged herself and held tight, as if only her arms were preventing her from falling apart, only for the breeze to carry new sounds to her sharp hearing. Hagrid was talking and walking in this direction, with another much quieter set of steps following him. What, did you think I would have found you an apartment in Diagon Alley? Rubeus snorted disdainfully. I'm not made of money, Tom. Besides, he added with audible smugness in his voice, you asked to get out of London, and Diagon is in the middle of it. You know perfectly well what I meant. The stranger's voice reached Marie, and she held back a grimace as she recalled Rubeus' words from a few days before. Necessity and circumstances that she had largely ignored meant that the house would gain both the unnaturally tall man and another wizard as residents for every summer, at least for a couple of years. And I have delivered. Some seriousness returned to the deep rumble that was Hagrid's voice. A 15-year-old kid on his own every summer would draw attention. Marie took a deep breath and planted her feet on the grass, raising from her seated position and walking back to the house proper, distractedly noticing that the vegetable garden was filled to the brim once more and that she'd need to take the ripe vegetables before long, while the breeze kept carrying forth the words of the two wizards. I can be inconspicuous. The stranger spoke. I still don't care. Hagrid replied dismissively, this is a good, out-of-the-way place that will not draw attention. Marie walked out from the corner made of bricks that Paul had spent weeks freeing from the moss, and she pushed through the hollow pain that throbbed in her chest to meet the newcomer. Ah, there she is. Rubeus spoke calmly, as if afraid to spook her as he slowly turned sideways. "Marie, this is Tom Riddle." "Tom, this is Marie Moulin." "A pleasure." The boy that walked up to her to shake her hand smiled softly, even if she didn't miss the somewhat tense posture of his shoulders. "Thank you for looking after Rubeus, he can be an oaf from time to time." Marie darted her eyes towards the taller wizard who shrugged with a single shoulder, while his shirt moved enough to reveal pristine bandages on his other one. She approximated a brittle smile as her mind went over to the explanation she received for Paul's death, only to quickly blink away the tears that threatened to jump out. When Rubeus had explained the events of the last full moon, she had wanted to hate him. But it was impossible to miss his wounded status, the thing that proved that he had been willing to put himself in danger to seek out a cure, and it was undeniable that neither she nor Paul would have managed any semblance of civilized life if left in France on their own. "A pleasure." She echoed the young wizard's greeting before turning sharply on her heel and beginning once more the rooting needed to keep the house in order. She moved as if she was observing her body from outside, the movements she had performed for years at this point coming automatically while she fell into a daze. She didn't want to think, and while there'd be time for a warmer introduction, her heart simply wasn't in it. Was it truly so necessary to bring a stranger in her home not even a week after the death of Paul? Tom observed the woman's stiff retreat with an arched eyebrow only to turn towards Rubeus. "You know, normal people at least feign to feel sorrow when the loved ones of someone else die." It was impossible not to notice how he had taken Hagrid's words on the night of the full moon and twisted them as if a knife already buried in the taller wizard's gut. Hagrid rumbled an incomprehensible answer under his breath and made his way to a large wooden table set on one side of the courtyard, sitting on a stump of wood that clearly acted as a stool for the tall Slytherin while he cradled his head between his hands. "I'm not very good with people, I help with facts, actions, not words. Were you ever meaning to tell me about her condition?" Riddle asked sardonically as he took a place on the bench placed on one side of the table, "or was I going to discover it on the first night of the full moon?" "You've figured it out already, Hagrid didn't move, and so he missed the smug expression on the Slytherin prefect's face. "You appeared on my floor with a cursed wound on your back that only a specific brew managed to seal." Tom started to list the elements that he put together. "I saw the older scars that you have on your other side, I know that your main project is that impossible cure, and I recognized the signs on her, of course." The taller wizard simply sighed tiredly, but he remained in silence. "I'm still waiting for my explanation, remember?" Riddle pressed him, leaning on his elbows. "Wouldn't you prefer to have a look around first?" His words were muffled by his hands, but he already had a defeated tone. "I'm sure that I'll enjoy passing here my summers until I can find my own place. But now I think I'll hear exactly what happened." Riddle grinned, and as it often happened, his expression was sharp and hungry. "It didn't escape me that in the Runda there aren't notes on your personal study of lycanthropy, merely a compendium of what can be discovered within the tomes already present in Hogwarts. Why would you care?" Again, the tone was muffled by the tall Slytherin hands, but the defeated tone had simply shifted to a tired one while Hagrid's large shoulders moved with his deep breaths. "Because you landed in my room in a ball of fire, bleeding out." Riddle's voice was jolly despite the topic. "Because I don't believe you made no headway on that project. Because I think that the two events are linked, because..." The Slytherin prefect stopped at the raised hand of the much taller wizard, who was eyeing the other from under a fringe of messy, dark hair. The two looked each other in the eyes for several seconds. Hagrid was completely serious, while Tom didn't bother hiding his eagerness. "Who knows, maybe my insight can help." "As if that was exactly the reason why we've built the Runda." A familiar grimace appeared on Hagrid's features, and he immediately tried to deflect. "It's kind of illegal, and you can't." "Rubeus." Riddle cut him off. "You almost died doing some of your obscure research, it'd be a pity if you left your mortal coil before delivering the cure you promised to Marie, wouldn't it?" The taller wizard straightened on his stump while he crossed his arms over his chest, unimpressed. "You mean that my death would cause a lack of extraordinary insight in topics that interest you even tangentially?" Riddle smiled unapologetically and waited for the story of how the usually bright younger wizard had managed to end up dying at Wool's. Slowly, haltingly, and surely with several pieces censured, the younger wizard began to talk, while one of his hands placed a broken disc of iron etched with runes on the table, his dark eyes never leaving the hungry ones of Riddle. "To overcome lycanthropy, a werewolf needs a hunt capable of pushing the beast to satisfaction, something capable of drawing the humanity back to the fore. I know that I've commented before on the curious holes in your knowledge, Hagrid." The voice of the Slytherin prefect was perfectly even while his mind rushed through the information he had just been given. And I've wondered more than once how much of what you acted upon was mere speculation instead of an actual understanding of the magic involved. With this event, you answered to both my interrogatives. For all of your talent in several fields, you're actually just lucky with not having died already, aren't you? Chapter 64, Harry Potter, Chapter 63, Courting Danger 2. And I've wondered more than once how much of what you acted upon was mere speculation instead of an actual understanding of the magic involved. With this event, you answered to both my interrogatives. For all of your talent in several fields, you're actually just lucky with not having died already, aren't you? Hagrid ignored the mocking tone to focus on what was implied, and then frowned heavily. You told me that runes were merely physical confirmation of the symbols used by the wizard attempting to enchant or curse something. And they are. Tom spoke as if he was facing a particularly stupid rock. But you didn't enchant anything, did you? You didn't make this seal, merely took this combination straight from a book, and haphazardly tried to repurpose it in an active ritual. Which is what the Norsemen did with that seal. That seal was used on the hunters. Tom was actually delighted by the opportunity of taking the taller wizard to school, as it were, and he didn't bother hiding it. And you placed it on yourself, while under the effects of who knows what to dedicate yourself to the hunt. Then you followed a prey that you don't want me to know about, and 2 werewolves, only to not hunt them. Riddle rose to his feet and threw his arms in the air in a mockery of a cheering fan. You didn't try to hunt any of those, and then you operate away, essentially reneging on the promise you made when you stuck that seal on yourself. The seal was meant to give direction and maintain meaning for the werewolves. The taller of the 2 replied, a frown on his face as he worked through what he was being told. Then why didn't you apply it to the beasts? Besides, you didn't use a series of runes, each independent from the others, you used a combination of them, that is basically an entire symbol on its own. Tom was bewildered, he couldn't believe how much Hagrid took for granted. Ancient runes are superfluous for a dedicated enchanter, but you made yourself part of a ritual involving werewolves. You bound yourself to the hunt. Thank your saints for the death of at least one of them, otherwise, there is a very real possibility that you'd have been torn asunder during the apparition. I knew I couldn't splinch myself. Hagrid grinned, even if his hand shook minutely when it landed over his still wounded side. Of course, that's what you take away from this conversation. Tom sighed, still conflicted between hilarity and exasperation. He spent every summer worrying for his own life, while Rubeus openly risked his at least once a month. Symbols convey the meaning that the caster understands, of course, but when you use more of them, the meanings intertwine to create something that can be wholly different. That is why most enchanted objects don't have an endless series of unique scratches etched into them. Making up symbols doesn't work as well as learning them as something that exists outside of yourself. And surely setting yourself up as a hunter for a couple of werewolves and another beast, well, the seal might have forced you to fight the werewolf without you realizing it. Rubeus hummed thoughtfully before speculating further. If the effects can be as unpredictable as you say, could the seal explain why I didn't think of operating away immediately? It very well might. Riddle replied with a frown. After all, you aren't one for extreme stupidity, at least once you're already in danger, that is. It wasn't the first hunt. Hagrid looked towards the sky while breathing deeply, his mind going over his memories of the previous attempts. Yes, I got that much, thank you. Tom interrupted him, sitting once more as he tried to reconcile the potion maker that Rubeus shined as with the madman that would endanger himself so thoughtlessly. That's spectacularly dumb, you court danger every step of the way, don't you? The older wizard sighed, his mind warring between being reluctantly awed and contemptuously vexed, as it often was when it came to Hagrid. After a couple of minutes of silence, during which each wizard tried to elaborate what had been told during the conversation, Tom spoke, I'll help you with Minerva. That made Hagrid tilt his head questioningly, what do you mean? She'll of course insist on inspecting your living conditions. Riddle smiled, smugness positively oozing from his tone, I imagine she'll feel much better if there is a prefect looking after you. Hilarious. Hagrid deadpanned, only to grin deviously, anticipating the punishment that he'd be able to deliver onto his companion with the excuse of teaching. Suddenly, I feel much better at the prospect of teaching you how to apparate. Well, Riddle couldn't let the almost suicidal wizard have the last word, not after the unique brand of stupidity that he had just revealed. At least we won't be taking part in rituals that hold our lives on the line while we do so. Under a sky that looked painted between the dark of a moonless night and the dying sunset, with just a few clouds hovering harmlessly over a forest rich with birch trees, the figures appeared with a deafening crack. The first was maybe 3 meters tall, and was leading a younger man and a girl. The three stopped holding hands when the girl fell to her knees and emptied the contents of her stomach on the forest floor, while the regular-sized boy took a couple of steps back and leaned his forehead against the nearest tree, breathing deeply as if willing himself to not imitate his female companion. "Stop!" Minerva panted, a tiredness stretching over her limbs as she looked at how Hagrid was already preparing himself for another apparition. "I can't apparate again, I need to rest." "What?" The question was so genuinely confused that she let out a wheezing laugh, a sound that forced Tom to turn on himself and stare disbelievingly at Hagrid, who had placed his hands on his hips in a frustrated mannerism. "You do not tire with apparition?" Riddle asked while he slid down against the birch tree at his back until he unceremoniously sat on the ground. "We must be halfway across France already." Rubeus, understanding that his two companions wouldn't continue, no matter what he said, slung off the knapsack he held across his chest. "We apparate only 5 times. And we crossed an incredible distance each time." Minerva almost hissed as she recovered. "You dragged us across the channel without apparating close to either shore. It took me a while to realize that we had crossed the sea, and we were already inland by then." "Well," Hagrid hesitated, as if unsure how to address the situation, "maybe you're apparating wrong. What's the problem? Feeling squeezed and twisted doesn't bother you at all, does it? No matter the distance?" "I wouldn't say that," the incredibly tall Slytherin replied. "It's like holding your breath, or taking a really long step. There is a limit to how far you can go, even if I haven't measured it. As for being squeezed, I simply push back until it's comfortable." "You push back?" Minerva rose back to her feet with disbelief clear on her face. "You push back? What kind of nonsense?" In the quiet of the forest, the silence was broken by Tom's laughter. His head was thrown back against the bark of the tree, not caring about the impact, as he let out the first loud, unrestrained laughter of his life. There was none of his controlled, usual flair, no thought for how he'd be seen, no plan about how to use that moment to his advantage. It was a strange feeling. He had felt it rise deep from his belly, bubbling up only to explode past his lips without his conscious consent. He had barely processed the revelations about Hagrid's mad attempts to find a cure, barely managed to exploit his good fortune by saving himself from Muggle London, barely worked through his new arrangements for the summers, and Rubeus just... He lost his breath in a wheezing bout of laughter. There just was no end, was there? For the first time, he found himself willingly swallowing the impossible, constant annoyance that Hagrid's existence caused. He gained too much from simply being near him. He had learned apparition in an afternoon, like it was expected from someone of his blood and genius, and now Rubeus, who by the way had been able to apparate since he was 11, casually revealed that it was possible to push back the feeling of being squeezed. "It's not possible to push back, Rubeus." Minerva spoke tiredly, rubbing the bridge of her nose with a motion she was growing increasingly familiar with since she allowed Rubeus to enter her life. "The tightness around you is the magic of the apparition. Even if it was possible to simply push, it'd break the process, and you'll end up splintched, or flung into a tree, or whatever, at speeds able to kill you." Tom started to recover his breathing, and by the time the good bickering between Minerva and Rubeus ended, the sunset was almost finished. He led them a bit further under the trees, until they entered a small clearing that was for the most part occupied by some strange hedge that described some sort of square. Then the pieces fell together, and under the light of their lit wands, they suddenly realized that this was one of the shacks that Hagrid had mentioned. It blended in with the surrounding greenery to the point that even during the day, Tom suspected he wouldn't have recognized it if he hadn't been looking for it. Shack didn't really describe what he was seeing. "Wow!" Minerva was much more open in her reactions, and she entered without hesitating. "Well, the sleeping arrangements will be a bit cramped. We'll just prepare some hammocks. I'll sleep near the ground on the long side, you two can figure out a way to climb." Hagrid spoke while Tom entered, taking in the transfigured tiles on the floor and the once improvised chimney that was restored with a little wand work. Soon enough, Minerva and Tom devoured the rations that they each had prepared, eyeing with barely contained suspicion the vials that Hagrid insisted worked perfectly well to sustain him through his travels. As he had cautiously avoided mentioning that those potions were the only thing he ate consistently through each summers, the Gryffindor which hadn't nagged him too much, potions holding the energy for patients unable to eat were a known thing after all. On the other hand, the Slytherin prefect wasn't going to annoy Hagrid when he clearly hadn't died after several summers and winter holidays spent surviving on it. "How good are you at expansion charms?" Rubeus asked distractedly while he stretched on his low hammock, only for the other two to snort and scoff. "They're too complex to be applied willy-nilly, they don't last as much as they need to," and they're easy to destabilize. Minerva answered with a huff, "No, we won't be sleeping in a shack turned into a cottage anytime soon. Now sleep, both of you." Riddle spoke drily, "We'll move with the dawn, no. Shouldn't you be sleeping too?" Minerva asked from her own hammock, raising her head enough for her face to be lit by the lumos that the Slytherin was using to work through a bundle of parchment. "I need to figure out how to make port keys, since Hagrid didn't manage it." Riddle replied slyly, "Unless you want to make the return trip through endless apparition too. Don't antagonize him deliberately, Tom." She reprimanded him slightly, only for the soft snore of the tallest wizard in the shack to rumble low across their bones. The tallest wizard was already asleep, and Minerva exchanged another snort with Riddle before closing her eyes, letting the tiredness of the day wash over her and drag her under. Chapter 65, Harry Potter, Chapter 64, Courting Danger 3. It happened on the 5th day. The travel across Europe had taken the better part of a week despite Hagrid doing the bulk of the work when it came to dragging forward his two companions. As each shack had to be checked over and occasionally repaired for them to be comfortable resting in there, that meant that they moved from dawn until dusk, pacing themselves so that the bodies of the two normal-sized mages could keep up. Courtesy of Rubeus, as soon as they were in Greece they set up a new shack, of obviously bigger dimensions at only one apparition away from one of the few regions that were still wild despite the local community of wizards and the ever-expanding muggles. Minerva had been the one to research and find where they were meant to go. The excuse about researching lycanthropy had never been thinner as they didn't even try to look out the magical district of Athens. The reasoning was that if something relevant was present among the known tomes or legends of the locals, it would have been mentioned, even offhandedly, somewhere in the Hogwarts library, which Rubeus had positively scoured for every bit of information that could be useful for his research. Seeking out in the wilderness a chimera was excused 3 times over, once by Rubeus' interest in crossbreeding, which was again a topic that he had already read everything about in the school's library. Once by Tom, who had taken to the idea of utilizing the creature's blood to turn his latest discovery into something truly unmatched in the world, and once by Minerva, that for all of her reluctance, was a Gryffindor at heart and couldn't resist the proposed adventure when her two companions had made it so real with so few words. The 3 wizards moved among the small trees that stood several meters one from the other, their feet flattening the little underbrush that managed to thrive in Greece despite the heat and the few showers of rain of that year, while their ears were peeled to pick up anything of notice above the distant white noise of the wilderness. They had spotted the odd magical creature here and there, creatures that Minerva hadn't managed to identify before Hagrid dismissed them as unimportant, but that still observed with beady eyes from places they deemed safe. Truly, that this section of the wilderness hosted magical creatures was the only thing that kept them going. 5 days, for 5 days had the Gryffindor witch accepted to wear the far more practical long trousers tucked into her boots in order to avoid the random branch from scratching her skin. During each of those excursions, Hagrid kept up a low murmur that was an uninterrupted commentary that attempted to teach the two of them how to move quietly, how to spot tracks, and so on. For some reason, he wasn't worried that his voice could scare away the imaginary prey that they spent each day looking for. Even if Tom had looked smug when she mentioned it, forcing her to clamp her mouth shut in order to hold back from insulting him, away from school, Riddle showed just a little of the maverick-like attitude that Slughorn enjoyed so much in their tallest friend. They were still moving in a precise direction, following Hagrid that crossed the irregular ground with insulting ease as Minerva had to complete 2 to 3 steps for each of his, when it happened, out of nowhere, a tree groaned ominously, causing everyone to whip their head in that direction, only for something to sweep her legs out from under her. In a flurry of movement, Hagrid cast his wand upward, and a wave of force passed by the still falling Minerva without touching her, flattening everything else in the immediate surroundings instead while Riddle slashed horizontally with his length of yew. A dark glee won his features as he reacted to a perceived menace. Still falling, Minerva changed, her limbs retracting and bending oddly as a tail whipped out from the end of her spine and twirled powerfully, making the cat she became land on its paws only to jump forward, just in time to avoid the return sweep of what her eyes now could see was an impressive girth of a snake's tail. She landed on her feet as a human once more, the instincts of her animagus form still thrumming in her while she pointed her wand at the ground. With no incantation, a small wall of stone put itself in place between her and the direction that the shoulder-high tail had just gone into, anticipating another possible attack while she moved to stand by the side of Hagrid and Riddle. Rubeus slashed with his wand, teeth bared in an approximation of a snarl while his powerful frame took a step forward as if he was wielding a sword, sectum spra. The tree between him and his target was bisected like it was made of air, and a small waterfall of murky green blood fell on the ground, immediately followed by a wet gurgle. Minerva heard him curse while Riddle smacked his elbow with his free hand, receiving only a grunt of confirmation. Everything had taken place in less than 20 seconds, and now that their enemy had lost the element of surprise, it revealed itself in all of its primal power. It left the deficient cover given by the irregular ground with a cacophony of threatening hisses. Parts of the environment that had looked like some fallen trunks covered by foliage and whatnot revealed themselves as sinuous, mighty necks, each carrying yet another serpentine head. "How many did you cut?" Hagrid's voice rumbled low against her back while Minerva tried to understand what they were dealing with. "3 before I realized what was going on," was Riddle's curt reply. The tallest among them grunted again. "I cut 1. It means it had only 4 at the start, doesn't it? And now it has 9. Rubeus replied, but his eyes were already darting around. The quick back and forth left Minerva floundering for an instant, until she put together what she was seeing. Each of the serpentine heads that emerged around her was identical, with hungry reptilian eyes that glinted red under the sun and an open maw of needle-like teeth that were positively oozing venom of a burning yellow. "A Hydra!" she hissed while her heart kept hammering in her chest. "You cut off heads from a Hydra? I don't think we can apparate before one of them lunges." Riddle spoke as if he hadn't heard her, "and splinching will be the last of our problems if one of those manages to bite. Minerva, you're on defense, keep the heads from us." Hagrid spoke loudly, and something in his stern tone made her resort, a bit belatedly, to what occlumency she had managed to put together with Professor Dumbledore. Immediately the world became much more simple to observe. The mindset of the hunting cat with the clarity of the human defined the rival predator and the allies by her side in a split second. "I cut, you burn." Riddle's voice was distant to Minerva's ears. She had been told what her task was, and she'd trust the 2 Slytherin wizards at her back. She'd throttle the both of them once they were safe. She thrust her wand of fur and dragon heartstring forth, and the world around started to change into something she favored. Animated trees swung branches with tips that began to turn into steel, puncturing a few wounds in the surprised creature while a cloud of dust whirled with metallic glints around the heads that looked ready to lunge. Still, with her heightened perception, she observed how delicate-looking ribbons spun from Riddle's wand, ribbons that cut impossibly deeply with a pang of hunger and cold rage that was focused on their edge. The obviously dark piece of magic moved at the speed of thought, tearing through some of trees that she had been animating without a care, while instead Rubeus simply brought the tip of his wand to his lips. Neither of the two had spoken an incantation, so the only noise that reached her ears was the cacophonous hiss of the Hydra coupled with the spell fire that was devastating the surroundings. Until Hagrid completed his spell, that is. While Minerva was raising once more a series of stone walls to stop the magical creature from clobbering them with its massive tail, fire blossomed from Rubeus' breath. A massive wave of angry red flames fanned out only to roll back while the tallest of her friends made a whipping motion. A wolf's head took shape at the head of the fire bolts that followed, and the flames howled with something not of this earth while they consumed the air that separated them from their targets. Where Riddle's ribbon cut, the snarling wolf's head made of flames clamped down with its fiery fangs. The outraged cacophony of hisses of the Hydra carried an undercurrent of agony while the blood from which new heads should have been sprouting boiled and seared, leaving behind a lucid cover of molten flash that slowly stopped being on fire. Under Tom's gleeful assault, the heads fell to the ground one after another, flames stopping the Hydra's infamous regeneration from kicking in while Minerva turned the stone walls into pack of wolves and murders of crows, the latter aimed for the magical creature's eyes while the first attempted to harass the body where all those necks sprouted from. Of course, it was then that everything went to hell in a handbasket. The Hydra's tail whipped sideways across the now wall-free ground, destroying the conjured wolves with insulting ease and reaching the 3 before Minerva could stop it. "Tail!" The shout left her while she was already jumping, with impossible grace and timing. All the power of her human legs propelled her upwards just as her body shrunk into the familiar form of a cat. Her jump was more than enough, and she saw the massive tail pass more than half a meter beneath her while one of the few remaining heads darted forward, its maw open and its needle-like teeth ready to destroy her diminutive form. The tail slammed against Tom's shield and flung him off his feet and stopped cold against Hagrid. A meaty thump resonated against the ground as the massive tail that would have crushed any normal human crashed against the braced form of their 3 meters tall friend. It reached just above his waist, and with a baring of teeth, Hagrid simply cast a weak banishing charm at her diminutive form, effectively pushing her away from the Hydra's head that was about to bit on her. Then, in a display that was truly spectacular, the flicker of flame that never stopped surging from her friend lengthened in a whip of cold light blue fire, where before the air wavered because of the heat of the wolf heads he had been cast in, it now misted over while infinitely small flakes of snow began to fall. The freezing cold flames surged forth in an arch that carried both the cruel edge of the winter and the purifying, searing cruelty of the fire. The flesh of the Hydra parted under the weakness that Tom had exploited up until that moment, and while the head fell, the exposed innards of the neck cracked and steamed, as if frostbitten. Minerva returned human and landed on her feet in time to see Riddle fall with his back against a tree stump that had been made during the battle, the last head of the Hydra a few meters from him while the neck that had been carrying it swayed and thumped against the ground. He was keeping one clearly broken arm against his side, his face was pale with mind-numbing terror, and there was a bloody gash on one of his thighs. A wound that was marred with the burning yellow venom of the nine-headed monster. The creature that attacked them had been defeated, but with the last attack that had broken the formation the three mages had assumed flawlessly, Tom had been on his own, just long enough to kill the last head. Just long enough to be wounded by a creature with one of the most deadly venoms in the known world. Chapter 66, Harry Potter, Chapter 65, The Rule of the Hunt. Admittedly, my first thought when I processed what I was seeing, was something like fuck yet. In a single instant, the unthinkable had happened, and Tom was dying. The boy because of whom I had almost turned grey with worry, was the only element in my life that I was unsure about. He represented that one conundrum that I seemed unable to solve. I knew the pros and the cons of either having him live or having him die. Time and time again, I went over them as logically as I could despite my personal preference for letting him live, exploiting the benefits of his existence in a way that would change my life and the world for the better despite whatever damage he'd ever grow up to cause. The diadem had exposed my own ruthlessness several times, that contraption had hammered again and again the point that the option of killing Tom was only fueled by my fear. Fear of feeling guilty over the crimes he'd commit, fear of being unable to oppose him if the time came, and most worryingly, fear of being irrelevant. Maybe it was a stupid reason to act as I did, but I just couldn't help it. That fear of irrelevance was that which pushed me towards dreaming what should have been impossible back at Ollivander's. That fear had basically fueled my conscious choice of raging against the odds since day one, to push and dig and thunder and scream as I tried to reshape the world to something that pleased me. With the Hydra dead, and Minerva already running forward towards Riddle, who was truly helpless for the first time since I knew him, I was left, for a handful of incredibly long seconds, completely reeling. It could end here. Zero effort on my part, or a token of it to fool Minerva, and I'd be done. I'd be free to just live my life, to leave Dumbledore to take care of everything, A&D. What then? Tom hadn't even tried to make it look like he saved me for the sake of it. I knew that he had already thought of leveraging my life to better his own. That was just how he operated. Everything in the world was there on a scale of how much useful it could be to him, and on that basis he took decisions. I knew that in my place, he'd be as calculating as I was. From over the shoulder of Minerva, who had already set his arm in a straight, conjured cast, Riddle's eyes met mine, and I felt incredibly cheated. I stepped forward while my mind took a completely different direction, my focus already on the consequences and possible gains of the decision I had made. And even as I felt myself slipping a bit more into the megalomania that never stopped growing under the surface, I couldn't help but think it, if he dies, it will be because he needs to. And since I was going to be potentially directly responsible for any disaster he committed, I knew that if he'd had to die, it'd be by my hand. With that resolve clear in my mind, I thought furiously about the possibilities, and by the time I reached Minerva, I knew what to do. It'd be hardly the worst thing I'd ever done, and nor nearly as dangerous as running around with werewolves, at least for me. Riddle. My curt tone snapped Minerva out of her panicked fretting while I could visibly see Tom using all of his skill in the mind arts to keep himself from falling unconscious. I pressed firmly against the cloth folded on his bleeding wound. If we do nothing, you'll die. I talked over Minerva's Scottish burr while Riddle inhaled sharply, his mind warring between the pain and the fear. If I take the time to brew the necessary antidote, you'll die before it can help you. This part has the added value of being true. And concluding my brief speech, I spoke once more, or I can do the impossible, but you'll both have to trust me, and not waste my time by asking endless questions. Frankly, it's your only chance at survival. Before my life as Rubeus Hagrid, I once read about how the mind could take two different directions when pushed to the breaking point. It could either stop, sending the victim into catatonia, or it could operate full throttle, making use of everything it had to find a solution. Probably Dune. It is always Dune when it sounds so smart and concise. And under my attentive gaze, I saw Riddle's mind ravenously tear through what I said him, what I meant, almost as fast as the words fell from my lips. He raised his unwounded arm to stop Minerva while his eyes never left mine. Do it. I could feel it almost physically, trust born of despair. His exceptional brain immediately picked up what the options were. recognized that I was the only one in a position to help, probably realized that I was being as calculating as he had been when he saved me, and decided. That was all there was to it, the cold, inhuman logic that had historically allowed humans to survive the impossible. And then I began giving orders like I had done it 100 times before. It was only theory, but an extremely solid one, and frankly, I had done more with less. Minerva, collect the 9 heads of the Hydra, bring them here, then transfigure the clearing. We need a flat surface at least 3 meters by 3. I conjured a strap and secured it around the cloth I had been keeping pressed against the wound caused by the Hydra. Riddle, you need to breathe slowly, and do everything in your power to keep your heart from hammering in your chest. Talking makes it beat faster, so just focus on your breathing, and swallow this. While he forced himself to swallow a bezoar, which wouldn't be enough to fight off the venom, but would keep him alive for a little while, I tapped just below his hip, and a numbing charm reduced the tension in his muscles as the pain he felt lessened. I repeated the process over his broken arm only to rise to my feet and stride quickly towards the main body of the creature we had just killed. It was a pity losing one of its most valuable parts, but it was the optimal course that I could see now that I had decided to save Riddle. This had an enormous potential, on several levels, and I didn't have the time to consider every implication, only the most immediate ones, and it was already too late to stop. Once more I fell into the mindset necessary for the spell I had improvised successfully to save Minerva from the Hydra, another thing that I'd need to truly think about, and once I used my size to roll the body of the magical creature on its side, my wand was thrust forward and dragged across its hide. The work was rough, and it was far from how I thought I would conduct my first rendering. My spell wasn't made for delicate, precise work, and the dead flesh that had been still warm under my fingers cracked angrily as it froze over. With a bit of finagling, I carved out the misshapen lump that was the Hydra's heart. It was an ugly, scaly thing with a form that I could barely make heads or tails of. It seemed to follow the classical snake's heart anatomy, 3 chambers only, and while that would have been interesting and worth investigating in another context, I instead quickly settled it over the ground while I summoned a nearby basketball-sized rock. It left the ground with a slight tremor, dragging after it lumps of dirt and splintered pieces of roots, and landed in my outstretched palm. I immediately began with targeted gouging charms. Transfiguration wouldn't be adequate, I needed a bowl made of rock, not something with a shape that suited my needs. The surface of my target cracked and splintered away, while I worked, and I stopped only when Minerva arrived by my side. By Morgana's. I saw her almost physically restrain herself from going on a tangent, only to keep talking as her practicality took over. I did what you asked. What now? I need water from the nearest creek, and my satchel of ingredients. Apparate back to the shack, get me the satchel, and pour the water in a transfigured bucket. 4 or 5 liters will be enough. My eyes met hers before she could apparate away, and I stared into her pupils, blown wide with fear, only to add. The water mustn't be conjured, understand? After her nod, I walked over to Tom with the stone that I was slowly carving into a bowl, and looked him as he kept his eyes closed and tried to do as I asked him. I'll need you for some creative mind arts when the moment comes. His breath quickened for an instant as he looked at me, only to regain control of himself with the absolutely inhuman precision and ease that I expected of him. At his quirked eyebrow, I explained, I need you to keep to the forefront of your mind the concept of a predator's success. What I need is for you to take the cat within Minerva's hunter's mindset, and align it with my understanding of the ritual we're going to perform. I set the complete stone bowl by his side before striding across the smooth transfigured stone that Minerva prepared. By hand, I took each of the Hydra's heads, and in groups of 3s, I described as many equilateral triangles as vertices of a bigger triangle. Of course, it was still equilateral. Chapter 67, Harry Potter, Chapter 66, The Rule of the Hunt 2. I set the complete stone bowl by his side before striding across the smooth transfigured stone that Minerva prepared. By hand, I took each of the Hydra's heads, and in groups of 3s, I described as many equilateral triangles as vertices of a bigger triangle. Of course, it was still equilateral. As I worked, I spoke out loud, knowing that Riddle would need a little groundwork to not get lost in what he'd see. 3 times 3, extremely stable, arithmancy tells us that much. You, Minerva, and I, 3 hunters for 1 prey, and to the victor, so to speak, go the spoils. I made sure that the geometry was on point before returning to Riddle, whose dark eyes never left me despite his growing pallor. If you stray, even for an instant, from what you need to take, you'll die and likely give me a headache. I grinned at the scowl that he didn't manage to hide. If you try to take anything that isn't offered, the ritual will see you as something trying to hunt me and Minerva, and given the contrast with the geometry at play, you'll die, technically, you'll die 3 times, but that's speculation. Minerva appeared with a crack and her expression immediately became horrified as she identified the beginning of the ritual I had set up, by Merlin. Grateful for the distraction, I levitated the bowl so that it sat in the middle of the larger triangle, only to take Tom and lift him in my arms to deposit him in one of the 3 triangles described by the Hydra's heads. You'll need to fold together my understanding of the ritual with the hunter's mindset that is her other form, and give back the result to both of us. Tom was extremely aware of the fact that talking, at least standing to what I had said him, would only accelerate his demise, so he simply glared at me while he hissed with pain, and I simply nodded back seriously. It wouldn't do to mock his powerlessness now. The main problem with rituals involving more than one person is that even the faintest unbalance behind the common intent can make everything go catastrophically wrong. I'm setting up a ritual to have us hunt or conquer the Hydra we just defeated. But the creature attacked us first, and one of us thinking predatorily about any of the other 2 will put him on the Hydra's side, so to speak, and basically he'll be consumed along with the property that we're going to subsume from the creature. I settled Riddle in one of the 3 triangles described by the Hydra's heads. He was less than half a meter from the center of the much bigger triangle that I had drawn, and I made sure that everything was equally distanced before directing Minerva to another triangle. This is my version of a pepper up, you'll feel it. I explained as I handed him the vial. It will give you the energy to stand and do what you need, but it will also set your heart on a race that will make the venom in you kill you in a matter of minutes. I settled the stone bowl in the exact center point of the configuration and I casually lit a fire under it. As I poured some water from the bucket that the Gryffindor witch had brought to me, I explained what she'd need to do. The brew I'm preparing will be the one shaping, with its story, the purpose of the ritual. And before she could interrupt, as she wasn't forced to keep her mouth shut in fear of dying faster, I went ahead. What you need to do, Minerva, is to keep to the forefront of your mind your animagus understanding of the hunt. Tom will nudge your thoughts in the necessary way, hold that understanding, do the same with my understanding of the ritual, match those 2 perspectives, and at his nod, we'll be taking a peek into his mind to synchronize, so to speak, our mindset. I never practiced with legilimency. The animagus objected only for Riddle to shake his head slowly and point at himself before nodding. Still somewhat pleased at the situation that forced Tom to keep his mouth shut, I translated, he'll take care of it. I don't think this is wise. She objected, Rubeus, rituals are dangerous, how do you even know? I began to explain without interrupting my movements. Slughorn told it in his very first lesson, every potion is a story. My hands moved while I took bay and olive leaves, only to shift to work with a pestle. Where the leaves had been added whole to maintain a background of enduring conquest, as I used them to call respectively upon the longevity of the olive trees and as the symbol historically used by Roman emperors to grasp the meaning of victory. The carnivorous slug's shells I was grounding into fine dust would be needed to summon both the concept of defense and that of hunger, which was the primal reason for hunting. Ground as they were, they'd suffuse the potion along with the olive and bay leaves that were already following a clockwise pattern. What I was going to brew after all was meant to work with the natural order of things. The hunter gained from the hunted it defeated. I was preparing the ritual with a single, precise purpose, to grant immunity from Hydra venom, nothing more, nothing less. That had arguably the secondary effect that any venom less potent than it would likely be ineffective on us for the rest of our lives. Permanency after all was the main selling point of rituals. It was a minor thing, but it was fundamental not to try to tweak things for personal advantage. It was going to be complex enough with 3 active participants. Any personal aims I could have for Parseltongue, which was something I would love to study, would completely send the ritual tits up. Never mind trying to take something from Minerva's animagus status. No, the only element of the ritual that had to give, so to speak, was the Hydra we had conquered, and us 3 needed to be equal receivers of the boon I was aiming for. My research and experiments to find a cure for lycanthropy aided me here. The solution was in overcoming the danger, not fleeing it. I kept talking before Minerva could hex me. What he neglected to mention, is that every potion is a localized ritual, in which the magic properties available by sacrificing ingredients are shaped into a concentrated result. Stirring clockwise 3 times with one of the bloodied fangs of the Hydra, I imbibed the concoction with the presence of our conquered enemy, and after adding the ground shells, I repeated the motion. Rituals are at once much simpler, as far as preparing and organizing ingredients go, than potion making. Of course, they are also more dangerous, and more often than not permanent. Can you guess why? Minerva looked still scandalized, but the raised eyebrows on Riddle told her that I wasn't spouting bullshit. Even lacking my innate talent for potions, even without having the undisputed genius of Tom, she was as sharp as they came, given how you phrased it, because the people involved in a ritual are part of the story. I smiled sharply at her as I added the third set of ingredients meant to set the stage of the story this ritual was meant to tell, but once told, a story remains, doesn't it? Burned in the memories of those that have heard it, written the blood of those that were present in it, empowering the magic of those that took an active part in it, singing in the souls of those that have been a part of it. So you could kill us all. She correctly concluded from my explanation while Riddle was staring at me with wide eyes. I knew that he knew that my mention of memories, blood, magic, and soul was a direct derivation from what he had told me once before. I read that the mind exerts will, the body has strength, magic holds power, and that the soul is a reflection of them all. I also saw the outrage in his conflicted expression. To him, that tidbit had merely been some obscure reference, something that briefly caught his attention only to be discarded when it lacked an immediate purpose. He was now conflicted between being engrossed in my explanation and despising me for having made something out of a piece of information that he deemed useless. Of course, one of the best solutions to the volatility inherent of putting yourself in a ritual is basing it on the number 3, I added as I added silvers of oak spark and a single scale that I had taken from the dead magical creature whose venom was slowly but surely killing Tom. The oak was the tree of kings, symbolizing rulership, while through the scale I grasped towards the shedding of the skin, which in this context was meant to signify an overcoming of past weaknesses. In particular, now we were all vulnerable to Hydra's venom, and after the ritual, we wouldn't be. Ultimately, there wasn't time for me to sit down and explain everything in detail, as on Riddle's pale face I could now see the faint outline of his darkening veins. As soon as the concoction was ready, I summoned the Hydra's heart that I had retrieved from the carcass, and kept it levitating above the potion that simmered of a uniform grey above the stone bowl. I walked toward Tom and handed him the uncorked vial he was meant to down. I helped him to his feet, and with the bloodied fang I had used to stir the concoction in the stone bowl, with no warning, I quickly jabbed his left hand. He left out a pained wheeze as the fang parted skin and flesh with insulting ease. It can't kill you twice. I reassured him. Walking towards Minerva, I saw her conflicted between berating me, crying because of Tom's imminent demise, and running away from my madness. Still, she was a Gryffindor at heart, and she had decided to trust me. It's the only way. She said it to reassure herself as much as to seek confirmation in my eyes. She must have seen something she approved of, because with her lips pursed in a thin line, she extended her left hand once I arrived close enough. With a thin smile, I repeated the motion, and Minerva's eyes scrunched for an instant when the pain registered. I walked over to my position, and stabbed my own left hand. I had to employ a bigger dose of strength, as my skin was far more sturdy than one of my companions, but I too felt the bite of the Hydra, and immediately, the slowly creeping venom through my veins. We're all equally marked now. I nodded to Tom, and I brought all my focus to bear on the ritual while I threw the fang away, as it had completed its purpose, linking us together with the concoction that shaped the bulk of the ritual's purpose. Riddle downed the vial I had handed him and immediately grasped his wand once more, his dark eyes meeting Minerva's green ones when she nodded, the urgency of the moment enough to push her hesitation aside, as she submerged herself into the peculiar mindset that she had spent considerable time building with Dumbledore. I noticed her body language shift minutely. Chapter 68, Harry Potter, Chapter 67, The Rule of the Hunt 3. Riddle downed the vial I had handed him and immediately grasped his wand once more, his dark eyes meeting Minerva's green ones when she nodded, the urgency of the moment enough to push her hesitation aside. As she submerged herself into the peculiar mindset that she had spent considerable time building with Dumbledore, I noticed her body language shift minutely. Her shoulders went a bit lax while her knees bent minutely, and her hand twitched minutely, as if she was barely able to contain the nervous energy that coursed through her. Riddle stood straighter while my version of a pepper-up gave him a jolt, and his eyes were hungry as he understood what Minerva had been building with the Transfiguration Professor. It took him maybe a minute, and once he was done, he retreated from the witch's mind. She didn't give any reaction to that, and it was comprehensible, as Riddle wasn't meant to attack her, only to understand. His fear for his life was the best assurance I could have asked for that he wouldn't be where he didn't need to. When it came my turn, I remained impassible, my mind in that odd balanced point between abstract meaning and its counterpart in reality. Every element of the ritual, from the stab wounds on our left hands to the way I had placed the Hydra's heads, was kept at the same time at the forefront of my consciousness. And Riddle saw it, and I felt him. There was no meeting of minds, focused as I was on the ritual, I simply felt something that did not belong observing, evaluating, and reaching the understanding that I so readily offered. We wouldn't need to think exactly the same thing in the same way, as the bulk of the work when it came to directing the ritual would be done by the brew in the stone bowl, but our intent had to be in sync, and the words that we'd speak out loud had to be said at the same time. Maybe half a minute after his mind had retreated, my eyes met his, and I was the one to observe the meaning of my ritual through the lenses of an animal's primal understanding of the hunt. Convoluted as it was, it added something deep that I could feel with the entirety of my being, something undefinable, something that only Minerva could have added to the situation at hand. I spotted Minerva's flinch when Riddle did what he had to make her grasp the combined comprehension born from my understanding and her animagus instinct, but it didn't matter, we were ready. The rest of the world seemed to fall away and disappear as we were left in a triangle, each of us with 3 Hydra's heads at our feet, surrounding a stone bowl with a lit fire underneath. Above it, spinning lazily maybe a handspan over the liquid, was the Hydra's heart. Guided by our now shared understanding of the ritual, empowered by the truly primal mindset of the animagus among us, we spoke as one. Heads of the One, at the feet of the winners. On the stage set by the grey potion simmering in the basin, it was as if the Hydra had just opened its eyes, present and uncontested as it still had to meet with the hunted turned into hunters. It made the liquid spin lazily, as if a dark shape moved just beneath the surface of the liquid. As an answer to the words spoke, the fire leaped from under the stone bowl to the Hydra's head sitting in a triangle at our feet, and it immediately assumed a white coloring while the macabre trophies burned without smoke or smell. Lit by the heatless flames at our feet that described changing shadows across our features, we continued without hesitation. We used our wands to cut ourselves and levitate 3 drops of blood each into the brew. Blood of the victor, to conquer the loser. The brew boiled violently as it recognized the beginning of the conflict it would be describing. Inside of the potion, it was as if Minerva, Tom, and I had just entered the stage. The hunt that the potion had been prepared to describe now had the 2 acting parts, and only needed the conclusion. Again as one, we pointed our wands at the heart that was still levitating above the stone bowl. Heart of the hunted, to be consumed by the hunter. The potion's chaotic boiling point quieted immediately as it was delivered a conclusion. The story it held was perfectly stable. It had a beginning in the Hydra's heads that burned smokelessly at our feet, a development in our appearance marked by the addition of blood to the brew, and a conclusion in the heart that was being consumed by the concoction. The heart fell into the brew, and in a flash of white, the heads that burned away into nothingness, along with the potion that disappeared, taking with it the fire that had been burning under it. Even if disappeared wasn't correct, I could feel it, searing for a single instant along my veins, and the creeping presence of the venom was conquered as the ritual took effect. It was done in an instant. Every element that had been used for the ritual was consumed in a magic that had no immediate, visible effect. Well, almost, Riddle let out a gasp as he fell forward, but his face was flushed, and there was a wild, unrestrained smile on his visage. His eyes were wide as he caught himself with his only working arm, his knuckles splitting on the ground as he refused to let go of the U-wand in his hand, but that he was aware of the results of the ritual was obvious. Minerva ran to him immediately, her worried eyes roaming over his wounded fur as she reassured herself of his health. Still weak because of the blood loss, Riddle was little more than a doll in her hands as she started to nag him about everything under the sun, and I couldn't help laughing at the image. That of course, was a mistake, as Minerva whirled on me with a crazed glint in her eyes, and you, don't get me started with. I tuned her out as my eyes instead fell on what was left of the Hydra's carcass. There was still much that could be valuable or at least useful, and I couldn't help the flood of joy that coursed through me. This, I realized, this is what I want to do. How could I not? With Tom and Minerva, we had bested a Hydra, and I successfully created a ritual that made use of all of our talents. This was what magic was meant to be, this is how a wizard was meant to live. With a spark of inspiration, I raised my wand, channeling that unbridled joy that made me feel truly alive, in a manner that I hadn't felt since when my wand had chosen me at Ollivander's, and cast Expecto Patronum. At the white starlight that blossomed from my wand, Minerva's voice quieted, and even the exhausted Tom looked flabbergasted at the surge of magic that took a defined shape amidst us, only for my eyebrows to climb as I observed the animal that observed me with eyes made of the purest light. Chapter 69, Harry Potter, Chapter 68, Aftermath. Our mind was proved better than the mind of the one we felt, our bodies overcame the battle while the Hydras didn't, and our magic clearly bested the creatures. Hagrid's voice was a cheerful rumble as he once more explained in the most concise and confusing way he could what exactly he had realized the previous day. So of course our superiority was enough to be set in stone, so to speak, and so, the venom of the Hydra and its lesser counterparts is no longer capable of overcoming us. The sun shone with might unknown to the Englishmen settled on the beach, the Greek sea shimmered under the light like a cloth made of diamonds, and the never-ending coming and going of the waves was akin to the breath of some colossal beast. The Mediterranean breeze carried on it the salt of the water, and just a hint of the dry presence of the white sand. All in all, it was a wonderful day, and Minerva had no reason whatsoever to be upset. Except that she was sitting cross-legged in linen trousers that were cut mid-thigh. Hagrid seemed more imposing than ever, especially with his dark hair contrasting against the white of the sand. His massive frame seemed a rock under a waterfall of sunlight, and irregular, silvery scars climbed over one shoulder and reached his clavicle as if the rays of the sun crashed more violently over the wrinkled patches of skin. Hunched forward over the necessary project he had to complete, with the black king piece that the three had been exchanging every time one achieved a notable result. His hands moved with surety over the different pieces of bleached wood. The respectable trunk that they had found washed over during the night had immediately caught his interest, and since the dawn, he had been working on it with extreme care. Feeling her wand eagerly thrum in her hand, Minerva almost gave in to the temptation of transfiguring him in an actual rock. At least mere stone had the good manners of being silent. By Morgana, a rock would have at least made the same sound when struck in the same manner. Hagrid seemed instead to take great joy in changing his answer every time Minerva made the same question. Worse for her mood, Tom looked like this time he had understood completely, so it wasn't us subsuming the essence of the Hydra. Hagrid turned with an indulgent smile on his face while his hands kept working on the wood, where before there was only an irregular shape. Now Minerva could recognize the much greater project she had helped design. Sadly, changing the shape of the wood would prove disastrous when it came time for the kind of enchantments it would require, and so she was stuck trying to come to terms with the obviously extremely illegal ritual her tallest friend had dragged her into. Her eyes lowered to the back of her left hand, where a perfectly circular scar marked what had happened the day before. It stood slightly upraised against her fair skin, and a small, insignificant and ordinary part of her lamented the blemish's presence, only for her greater self to take pride in it. She had proven the better hunter. She had survived a hunter's attack, and now her scar would show the world that she went from the hunter to the hunter herself, winning something that could hardly be measured. Immunity from any venom of equal or lesser potency. She recalled the events of the previous day, of course, and she was aware of every detail, but that bone-deep understanding, that sky-bearing certainty that she had enjoyed during the ritual wasn't quite there. Of course, she knew that if a form of magic capable of teaching directly to the mind of the student actually existed, she'd have heard of it by now. But as Professor Dumbledore had clarified during their very first lesson of occlumency, not two minds were alike, and as such, no magic could be learned by memories. That was because each wizard or witch began every spell from their own perception and understanding of the reality that was about to change. It didn't mean that with time Minerva would be unable to reach her own personal understanding and mastery of the ritual. It simply meant what she had always known: there were no shortcuts for knowledge. It was one of the reasons why wit-sharpening potions were forbidden only during tests and exams, but while regulated because of the rather dangerous side effects, they could be consumed for study. She eyed quietly the black king that hung on a leather string from Rubeus' neck. He had deserved it thrice over, there was no doubt. "I'll get it soon," she vowed, her hand clenching tightly around her wand as her attention snapped back to the present. "That would require us to completely understand what an essence, as you mean it, is." Rubeus returned his eyes to the delicate etchings he was carving into the wood, knowing that mistakes at this stage would cost much time to be corrected. "You probably mean the soul. But as you once said, the soul is a reflection of the three pillars that in their entirety make us us." Under Tom's piercing gaze, Minerva wound herself instinctively adding, "while our souls are that which makes us ourselves." The other two wizards contemplated in silence the words of the witch that sat on a transfigured chair in a conservative linen dress, only for both to nod thoughtfully, making her smile. Hagrid's insight into the workings of the ritual was utterly alien to her mind, even now that she had lived through it. That particular memory was akin to an off-color painting of a blurred subject. She could say what the colors were, but she couldn't for the life of her describe the subject in the frame. Riddle too was dressed in transfigured clothes, as the bandages wouldn't have allowed him his regular choices, while the heat forbade the use of the thick robes necessary for Hogwarts. He was laid on chaise longue transfigured from the sea foam, courtesy of Minerva, and its cool presence soothed his aching body while sustaining his back enough for him to look at his companions. Companions that had willingly stabbed themselves with a Hydra's fang to complete an experimental ritual meant to save his life. Oh, Hagrid had explained, and what little of that experience remained in his mind agreed, that it was necessary for the other two hunters to be equal before the presence of the hunted. Any imbalance in the presentation of the victors upon the one would have clashed against the geometry of the ritual, potentially setting off unpredictable effects. Which included but weren't limited to, dying horribly while their hearts cracked like eggs and gave life to 3 separate hydras that would instead enjoy a human level of intelligence, bodies capable of undergoing an animagus transformation, and venom capable of eroding wards. Maybe the last 2 points were a joke, sometimes it was hard to tell with Rubeus. In any case, it seemed that he was intent on keeping up his uncanny ability to defy whatever mental model Tom could build for him. Sometimes his choices were predictable, but he could almost never guess how he'd accomplish something he set out to do. Rubeus, the unnaturally tall student that had eyed Tom while he was dying as if he was an ingredient for a potion. The humongous wizard had coldly calculated exactly how much he stood to gain from saving him, and exactly how much he gained from the manner in which he saved him. Frankly, the excuse of not having enough time to brew an antidote, considering his discovery of the mirroring method that he had applied since his first year, didn't ring true at all. Besides, mind, body, and magic that we call our own aren't meant to take pieces of others, never mind something as different under any point of view as a Hydra. The younger Slytherin student kept talking. Trying to take, I don't know, the regenerative ability of the Hydra for ourselves, besides requiring a completely different ritual that I can't even imagine, would dramatically change our body. How that would affect mind and / or magic is unpredictable, but the human brain goes off the rails with almost nothing, so insanity in some form, while the magic would likely take some flavor, that'd affect everything we'd attempt to do permanently. The section of white wood that Hagrid was working on was set aside only for another to take its place. Several panels in different triangular shapes were slowly being shaped by the careful work of his wand, and under the attentive supervision of Minerva. That pinned him in place with her predatory green eyes. He was content of answering any question about the current situation, and the prior's day chain of events. With a few finishing touches, Rubeus rose to his feet and stepped back from the pile of white wood panels that he had crafted, his dark eyes scrutinizing them carefully as if seeking any imperfection. While all of them had the same thickness and were as smooth as magic could make them, there were minute ridges along some of the edges, and hair-thin channels that went in straight lines across the natural grain of the wood. "You're up, Minerva. How did you think of it?" Satisfied of his understanding of the ritual that saved his life, Riddle pushed aside his more personal thoughts about his odd relationship with both Hagrid and McGonagall, focusing instead on the object that the two had been busy crafting since they had managed to return to the minute cottage they had built by the sea the day of their arrival in Greece. While reading up for those runes, the two wizards exchanged a meaningful glance while Minerva was busy. "I read about a ship, skip bladder, or something along those lines, that in Norse mythology was described as a vessel able to be folded and enter a pocket." "Splanir." Riddle corrected him while his mind already went in another direction. "And by any chance, did you begin planning how to make such a ship? Once we all learn how to port Kayat, the return trips will be considerably easier, but to reach a new place." Minerva stood from her chair and raised her wand. Without any verbal incantation, the panels of wood started to rise and place themselves in a complex geometric pattern that only she was able to keep in mind. Under her guide, the matching ridges on the pieces of wood held one next to the other clicked together, seamlessly joining each other in an ever-growing three-dimensional shape that soon cast a big shadow over the two wizards. "I toyed with the idea of other applications of your remarkable ink, but I didn't have the time to actually plan anything. As for the travels, I thought I'd be going ahead operating, then send you a portkey to my location." Hagrid's voice caught Riddle from his reverie, and he couldn't help but smirk. "Portkeys cannot be sent, they must be made where they are meant to take off from. Also, we've only moved to and through Muggle or inhabited locations, magical districts aren't quite that easy to reach. You'd know it if you actually managed to learn how to make them." Riddle couldn't help but tease Hagrid now that he had found a piece of magic that was for the time beyond him. "Are you offering to apparate ahead for each of our travels?" Chapter 70, Harry Potter, Chapter 69, Aftermath 2. "Portkeys cannot be sent, they must be made where they are meant to take off from. Also, we've only moved to and through Muggle or inhabited locations, magical districts aren't quite that easy to reach. You'd know it if you actually managed to learn how to make them." Riddle couldn't help but tease Hagrid now that he had found a piece of magic that was for the time beyond him. "Are you offering to apparate ahead for each of our travels?" The broad, scarred shoulders of the Slytherin shook as he snorted. "Not quite." And since he was perfectly aware of what Riddle had been doing, Hagrid's face morphed into a soft expression as he raised his wand once more. "Expecto Patronum." The incantation was spoken as softly as a whisper, and Riddle was quick to shake off the creature of starlight that had taken shape over his left knee, with an absence of sound that made it look even more ethereal than it was. The barely 8 centimeters large spider skittered on the air as if it was solid ground, moving deceptively quickly with its deceptively strong legs. Despite being small and monochromatic, the patroness' hairless carapace covering the front part of the spider's body managed to perfectly convey its shiny nature, while its 8 eyes remained unblinking and shining just a shade lighter than the rest of the body. It had fangs that pointed straight down the body and due not towards each other, taking away some of its eerie looks. With a boisterous voice, and while his eyes didn't leave his patroness, Hagrid asked, "Did you manage it yet?" Tom, knowing that the question had been coming, shrugged dismissively. Given the low probability of being attacked by Lethofolds or Dementors, I chose to focus on learning how to make a portkayat. Minerva turned with a smile on her features while the result of her work slowly levitated back on the soft sand of the beach, and he's also worried that you'll make fun of the shape of his patroness when he succeeds. Well, it's not like you two didn't think about making fun of it, am I wrong? The spider dissolved in motes of light, the quiet cheer it brought dissipating under the sunlight while the witch and Riddle exchanged a guilty glance. Despite the insane difference in size, a spider was hardly a glamorous animal to represent one's brightest feelings. Of course we didn't. Minerva lied so brazenly, and so badly, that the other two couldn't hold back a snort, but I can't guarantee that we'll hold back once we manage it ourselves. I'm more interested in those fiery hound heads you summoned yesterday. They proved surprisingly effective, but they were unlike any cursed flame I've ever read about. Riddle commented idly while he placed the roll of parchment he had been studying on a surreptitiously conjured low table. I don't know if I'd call them a curse, Hagrid answered distractedly, but his eyes were already on the result of Minerva's handiwork, and his voice absent, merely some sort of animation applied to tongues of flame. Where before there had been only a pile of different-sized triangles of smooth white wood, there was now only an impressive sheet of joined parts that unfolded not unlike some odd 7-petaled flower from a single piece of white wood shaped as a lidless, trunk-sized, rectangular box. The construct was clearly meant to be a trunk, but there was no clear line where its base ended and where its vertical panels began, never mind the complete absence of a lid. Let's see if it worked out. The taller wizard spoke while the other two went over his words. Under the guide of slow movements of his wand, the seamlessly joined panels of white wood started to fold one against the other, as if the petals of a flower were closing because of the incoming night. It was almost mesmerizing in the way the perfect, rigid geometric shapes seemed to flow counterclockwise, settling against each other until they formed a beautiful lid. It stood atop the trunk like a flower bud, if a bit more unforgiving with its angles. Instead of the promise of unfurling petals, it simply looked like the wood panels that composed the lid. The great number of pieces that couldn't have possibly managed to fold so perfectly as to stay completely within the area defined by the trunk's base, had been stuck in the box under them, leaving only their edges to show. I'd hardly classify fire that malevolent as uncursed, Rubeus, especially given how the heads seemed to seek out the cut necks of the Hydra on their own. Riddle's voice was the first to be heard after the fantastic display that was the result of Minerva's plans, but even on his carefully blank face it was easy to spot the almost familiar, barely restrained twinge of interest. It was as close to showing genuine respect as Tom ever got, but for Minerva and Rubeus, that faintest raising of his eyebrows was a noteworthy success. Truly interesting pieces of magic defy a clear-cut definition, and who are you to call those wolves malevolent? What is order to the spider is chaos for the fly. Fire can be almost anything, and that it's used as the base for all charms is hardly a coincidence. Flames devour wood and give heat, smoke, and ashes. My spell brought together the focus of a hunting wolf, its hunger, with the nature of the fire. Rubeus shrugged as he moved in a circle around the large trunk that Minerva had planned. I'll polish the outside first then, are we sure? There is no doing over once I'm done. I can hardly figure out something better in the few days we have. Minerva's lips thinned minutely in annoyance. If your brew can do what you promised, then yes, stick to the plan. So we'll be done within the day. While Rubeus nodded and took some of his freakishly long strides towards one of two large cauldrons that he had left to rest on the foreshore, Minerva turned her attention towards the still bedridden Tom, who was looking at the sea from under the shade of the small transfigured pavilion that kept him from the heavy glare of the sun. Her curiosity still not satisfied, she rose a challenging eyebrow while crossing her arms. What about your cutting ribbon, Tom? It hardly felt benign. A rather bland curse meant specifically for magically resistant creatures. He shrugged. It'd hardly work against a dragon, but a Hydra's true strength is in its regenerative power, not its resilience. I noticed that you didn't hesitate in classifying it as a curse. Her tone turned sterner, her gut pushing her towards censuring his choice. Tom simply smirked at her instinctive reaction. That'd be because I've learned it from a tome that defined it so. It operates a bit leveraging hunger, a bit with the swiftness of the wind, that's what gives the ribbon its speed. Minerva's brow creased with worry, and her lips thinned a bit further. Do you study curses often? Riddle's expression didn't change, but his dark eyes seemed to shine with amusement as he glanced toward the sea for an instant before assuming a more serious tone. Magic is magic, Minerva. Didn't we build the Runda with the exact purpose of studying what we wanted to? McGonagall's shoulders stiffened minutely, uncomfortable with the topic even if she felt that, given the proven usefulness of the curse, maybe her blanket ignorance on all things dark that weren't part of the Hogwarts syllabus wasn't the best long-term strategy. She had hardly been able to wound the Hydra with her current skill set, had she? It was remarkable how Hagrid had appeared able to immediately direct her towards the role in which she'd be most effective. Most effective, or less of a hindrance? I haven't found notes either from you or Hagrid about curses. They're hardly a topic worth taking notes about. Riddle replied quietly, you didn't find my notes on the Lumos charm either, did you? The animated flames of Rubeus seemed a complex piece of magic. She spoke with her frown deepening. Could it be that it was Hagrid the one holding back from sharing his more interesting notes? It hardly made sense, when the Runda had been his idea in the first place. Besides, her tallest friend hardly seemed the type. I hardly think that Hagrid learned that piece of magic from a book. Riddle read her shifting expression with impressive ease, and his observation was given with the intent of leading her towards a very specific conclusion. You are trying to say that he crafted that spell on his own. Her eyebrows climbed on her forehead, but it wouldn't explain why there's nothing about that in his notes in the Runda. Which makes me think that he only figured it out in the heat of the moment. Riddle tilted his head as he observed Rubeus not bothering with a levitation charm and instead merely lifting the decidedly too heavy cauldron full of potion from the foreshore. Only to drag it back with his shoulders tense enough that they looked like a drum skin. Wait until Yule before confronting him, he's likely to add those notes to the Runda by then. And there it was, hidden under the placid facade that Riddle always kept on when he wasn't trying to be deliberately charming, there was a flicker of something unnamed. He himself would have refused to recognize it as anything beyond idle curiosity, but it was unsettling how time and time again, Hagrid managed to achieve the unthinkable. I wonder what else he'll come up with the next time that his life is in danger. Chapter 71, Harry Potter, Chapter 70, Aftermath 3. He himself would have refused to recognize it as anything beyond idle curiosity, but it was unsettling how time and time again, Hagrid managed to achieve the unthinkable. I wonder what else he'll come up with the next time that his life is in danger. Minerva, catching his drift, eyed once more the silvery, jagged lines that were the scars on their nearing companion, and asked, I didn't want to pry, but those scars. Werewolves. The dry answer made the witch choke on her own tongue while she felt molten lead settle in her gut. What? Of all the... She whirled back towards Riddle, her fur wand thrumming nervously in her hand. Is he? He wasn't bitten, no. Tom immediately assured her while shifting his shoulders, adjusting the way that his weight pulled at the bandages on his arm and thigh. If he was eyed. Riddle wound himself not completing that period. If Hagrid was a werewolf, he'd... What? It wasn't like he had the habit of strolling with Rubeus under the moonlight, and he'd hardly be more dangerous than he could be at the present. Maybe a bit easier to manipulate, if what was written about the wolf's instinct was true. What were you talking about? Hagrid's rumbling voice took his two companions from their reverie, and both turned towards him as he settled the waist-tall cauldron beside the project realized in wood bleached by the sea. Minerva was curious about the dark arts. Riddle answered too fast for Minerva to object, even if he earned himself a scathing glare because of it. With his wand held aloft, Rubeus started to funnel the crystalline liquid in an upwards arc that landed on the top of the white wood. The brew immediately seeped into the solid, almost like sand drinking the water of the waves at every passage. Second by second, the liquid reached lower upon the structure, as the material beneath it was saturated by the potion. Strange thing for you to be curious about. And what is that supposed to mean? A slight Scottish burr entered the witch's voice as she snapped towards her tallest friend. Rubeus shrugged while he kept his focus on spreading the potion over the white wood. Well, if it isn't about the noble art of transfiguration, you're hardly ever interested enough as to seek out answers on your own. In any case, Riddle cut in before the two could truly get started with their inane bickering. I too would like to hear your opinion on the matter, Rubeus. Listening to our professors, the dark arts are anathema to every upstanding wizard or witch, but we can hardly argue against their usefulness after the debacle with the Hydra, can we? Hagrid snorted as he tilted back the project crafted out of bleached wood, directing his last mysterious brew in an upward swing that seeped into the bottom of his and Minerva's creation. Well, just to be clear, there is dark and dark. His expression turned taunting when he turned, and the black king piece he was using as a necklace dangled mockingly on his broad chest. Politically speaking, everything that the government cannot control is a topic, how could I say it? Discouraged from being discussed. Like a clemency. Minerva was quick on the uptake, as she still disliked heavily the implication that such an important thing was kept quiet from the masses. Dissent takes its first steps in secret. Tom of course was even faster in nailing down the main reason why the mind arts were kept from being widely known. Also, the more people know a clemency, the less useful legilimency becomes, and the less of an advantage certain families can have over the ignorant. Hagrid nodded quickly, as he sat once more on the sand, the empty cauldron laid forgotten by his side. Also, one of the main preoccupations for any government is to stop the shaping of elements that can grow more powerful than itself. For Muggles it isn't really a problem, as it is merely a question of numbers, but with magic thrown in the mix, individuals can rise far beyond the point where mere numbers can hold them back. Look at Grindelwald, and he also has an army believing in him. So the more powerful spells are simply, what, erased. The note of censure in Minerva's voice made Tom grin for a second. It wasn't hard to believe that the Sorting Hat had been undecided between Gryffindor and Ravenclaw with this particular witch. I wouldn't say erased. Rubeus smiled mischievously as he hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees, merely restricted. After all, you never know what can become useful later down the line, or when you have to fight fire with fire. Also, as individualism is such a fundamental part of what makes us wizards and witches, we'd hardly be the first ones to seek forbidden knowledge exactly because it is forbidden, and this is why the Department of Mysteries was created, I think. Also to research the kind of distasteful but necessary things to keep magical Britain from being invaded. Tom added with a thoughtful expression, once more revealing just how intuitively he could disassemble different elements and topics to recreate a single, logic-proof picture. Minerva walked over the trunk of white wood and touched the tip of her fur wand against the top of what looked like a closed flower, silently levitating it to the side before unfurling the lid in another mesmerizing show. Even as she acted, however, she talked, because her curiosity had hardly been sated. You're insinuating that the Department of Mysteries should be as well called the Dark Arts Department? For the truly mysterious pieces of magic. Riddle corrected her with a sly smile while he adjusted once more his position on the chaise longue, a bare single foot lowering itself to touch the fine sand of the beach. That they happen also to be unreasonably powerful in certain situations, well, that is merely a fortunate consequence, isn't it? What about the other kind of dark arts? Minerva was walking around the opened flower that was the lid of the trunk she was about to operate her magic on, her curiosity pushing her forward still, those that are deemed so not because of politics. I'm hardly an expert. Rubeus began, only to be interrupted by Riddle. But you've thought about it. Of course, I've thought about it. The younger Slytherin snapped back, it's what I do, I think. At Minerva's fake cough, which failed utterly at hiding her amusement, her tallest friend resumed his explanation. Casting most curses is rather simple, once you managed to feel the requisite anger or dread or whatever. A clemency helps preciously little in those cases, as you can't trick yourself into truly feeling. Would you say that the patroness is a benign piece of dark arts? Rubeus snorted at the snide observation of Riddle, which going by his smile, had been made exactly to irk the tallest wizard, instead of being an actual doubt. All kinds of charms that require emotion in some form are far more complex than anything else that can be cast through a wand. That doesn't make them dark arts. I believe that emotion funneled into transfiguration is the process that delivered us the memorable doors to the Runda, unless I've completely misunderstood Minerva's notes on the topic. You didn't. After the witch's distracted confirmation, and a warning glance towards Riddle, Rubeus resumed his speculation. If we want to be pedantic, we can label esoteric all the pieces of magic that require emotion to be cast properly. When these leverage dark feelings, then we're talking about the dark arts. Minerva stopped her examination of hers and Hagrid's handiwork in order to focus all of her attention on her tallest friend, while Riddle, who had the faintest smile on his features that screamed indulgence, managed to drag himself a bit higher on his chaise longue, giving the impression of sitting straighter even if he was still mostly horizontal. Every act of magic is more or less an imposition of our will upon reality. Rubeus gesticulated animatedly as he spoke, trying to put in order the maelstrom of thoughts that like always raged inside of his uncommon mind. Those emotions that have a violent component, tend to be easier to cast, because all living beings have an instinctive fight or flight mechanism, both as an answer to the primal fear of death. The dark arts are said to be seductive, in my opinion. Because acting following something as undeniable as the primal push towards survival is easier than relying upon the feelings that make up the patroness charm, for example, while the effects are arguably just as powerful. Riddle snorted from his position, his eyes widening with barely restrained disbelief. Is that your explanation? The dark arts are dangerous because they're easier. Also, if you get used to a certain mindset, it's something difficult to abandon. Rubeus didn't miss a beat while his eyes met Tom's. We are biologically predisposed to answer to any challenge with violence. To dominate the opposition with overbearing might, to inflict such pain as to never be threatened again, to take joy from the enemy's ruin, to hate and kill those that we see as a threat. Unfazed by the oblique reference to the 3 unforgivable curses, Tom narrowed his eyes in suspicion. Discovered that on your own, did you? Hagrid shook his head without taking his eyes off Minerva, who seemed focused on parsing what had been told. Merely an observation of mankind's nature, we're creatures of habit. Our circumstances shape us just as our choices shape our circumstances, but while for muggles constant, repeated choices and mannerisms can only affect their thought patterns, we always have to deal with mind, body, and magic. And you think that our magic gets used to what we cast? The witch asked with her wand held loosely in her hand, her green eyes fixed upon her tallest friend with uncommon intensity. Isn't easier to use a charm you've practiced 1,000 times? Rubeus asked as an answer, only to turn towards Tom, who seemed particularly thoughtful. Isn't it odd that Minerva would rather transfigure a tongue of flame into a scarf than to cast a warming charm on herself? An interesting concept. The Gryffindor witch nodded while she worked through the heavy words of her tallest friend. He played the fool more often than not, with dim-witted jokes and uncaring attitude, but on some occasions, it was possible to see the mind behind the outrageous notes that littered his desk in the Runda. Not happy with the brief silence that stretched between the 3 of them, Rubeus spoke again, this time his eyes never left Tom's. To use a select amount of spells, to stop learning new things, is to stagnate. To stagnate, is to die. Chapter 72, Harry Potter, Chapter 71, Aftermath 4. The summer sun shone cheerfully amidst the few stretches of white clouds while a cool breeze from the ocean ruffled the feathers of the owls and the long, grey fur of a Norwegian forest cat that moved too purposefully for it to be natural. The French village wasn't any more picturesque than any random one present on English soil. It wasn't quite rural, the roads were covered by cobbled stones, and the 2-stories buildings were of the kind that hosted a shop on the ground floor, and the family owning it right above it. Unlike Diagon Alley, Repose de Jean wasn't overtly magical. Sure, the shops hosted magical businesses, and there was the odd goblin or hag moving about, but there was none of the thundering joy that characterized the main shopping hub of magical Britain. The colors of the buildings rolled between white and a pale light blue, the signs weren't enchanted to sing about the greatness of the wares, and of course, there wasn't a Gringotts Bank with its distinguished marble, no Ollivanders with its mysterious, ancient air. The big cat trotted across the streets and took a coiling road that led to the outskirts of the village, where a small chalet on 2 stories rested in the middle of a roughly circular courtyard surrounded by a low wall of fluvial stones piled over each other. The ground itself was covered by green, lush grass that swayed gently in the cool, oceanic breeze, and the feline jumped adroitly on top of the wall, its green eyes washing over the property with the detachment typical of the creature. After taking a measure of the area, the cat quietly jumped off the wall and crossed the courtyard, reaching the door just as it opened, revealing the appearance of a man. He stood around 1 meter and 75 centimeters in height, with salt and pepper hair that fell just shy of his narrow shoulders. His lightly tanned skin and shaved jaw acted as a background for the straight, long nose and piercing hazel eyes. With his deep expression wrinkles, he could be anywhere between 40 and an extremely youthful-looking 65-years-old random muggle. His hazel eyes were fixed on the cat sitting in front of him, studying the creature with an interest it hardly deserved. There was no threatening motion on his part, no telling bulge in his button-up shirt that might reveal the presence of a wand, and no mundane weapon strapped to his waist. Yet the witch in a cat's shape was frozen as she tried to overcome the man's presence. He looked ordinary in every sense of the word, yet, something just beyond conscious thought was stirring in alarm. An instinct that had proved invaluable during the previous adventure of her summer was pulling Minerva by the ears, and without her conscious input, the hair on her tail flared up in warning. Still sitting in front of the open door, with her tail puffed up, Minerva remained still for what felt like an endless second. "Ah," the man spoke with a slightly nasal voice, sheer understanding of the situation wrapped like a heavy cloak over his narrow shoulders. "You must be Minerva." Silently, he moved aside, inviting her into his home while his hazel eyes rose once more to scan the edge of his property. The cat managed to cross the threshold and to take a few steps in the well-lit corridor before the door was closed behind her, and she felt for an instant like she was underwater, the wards intertwined with the house's wall passing over her and through her with a weight that she immediately disliked. "I probably could manage a conversation with a cat, but I imagine it is hardly needed." The man's nasal voice shook Minerva out of her temporary uncertainty, and with a ripple too fast for the human eye to follow, her shape grew until the cat was once more a witch. Standing with her back held so straight it was almost painful, the Gryffindor witch gave a brief curtsy. "Master Flamel, it is an honor." "We will see about that," the man replied with otherworldly calm as he passed her by, and she was forced to quicken her pace to follow him in a living room where a tea set was already waiting. Englishmen still enjoy tea beyond any reasonable limit, do they not? The man sat into a straight armchair and quietly invited her to do the same. "I accepted to talk with you to stop young Albus from pestering me through Pernell." His eyes fixed themselves on her hands as she drank the jasmine tea that carried just a hint of honey. "If I was the kind of person to cater to other people's wills, I'd never get anything done, and I never took a student incapable to finding me on their own, never mind one as young as you." Minerva hadn't managed yet to introduce herself, and this man had apparently already decided to refuse to teach her. Besides the disappointment, a burst of anger was quick to flush her cheeks. If this is the case, she sniffed as disdainfully as she could manage despite the wonderful tea warming her mood, "I don't see why you couldn't have said so in a letter, sparing me the time to come here. If you think that time is an issue, then alchemy is not suited for you." The reply was given as uncaringly as one might comment on the weather. "But you're quite lucky that Pernell made me promise to at least meet you. She's terribly prone to cave to young Albus when he gets emotional, you see." Those words stopped Minerva, who simply gazed inquisitively at the impossibly older man. Had he just implied that upon seeing her he had changed his mind? "Had I not met you personally, I would have missed the ritual scar on your left hand, and dismissed you as another of the countless talented and absolutely uninteresting, unoriginal students that spend years fruitlessly seeking me out." The man spoke without any discernible accent, with no particular tone, and yet each of his words carried an incredible weight. The witch ut down her cup only to hold her left hand in her right, feeling incredibly exposed for a moment, before her quick wit came to her aid once more. "Are you saying that you only take students capable of finding you, and that are interesting? Albus of course doesn't know of the ritual you partook." Flamel mused out loud, completely ignoring her words. "He can be terribly opinionated when it comes to the less common pieces of magic, and given the lack of scandal surrounding you, I'd say that nobody even noticed, although it can be because of the widespread ignorance that plagues most countries nowadays." Minerva's lips thinned in distaste at being ignored, and after a few minutes of silence, just when she was about to be fed up with that man, Flamel asked, "How would you measure eternity when time doesn't touch you?" "The only way is to submerge yourself with mankind." He answered immediately, "This is why I live with a new name and a new face every century, or so. I got lost in my research from 1588 to 1711, and the world changed too much for my tastes. It took me the better part of the century to learn how to live in a world with a statute of secrecy, and another 50 years to relearn how to throw busybodies off my tail." After another penetrating glare, the man took a deep breath, nodding to himself as he read something from Minerva's expression that confirmed an inner thought of his. "Albus did give us some particularly entertaining years, only another managed, sometimes before. To be frank, I had no intention of holding the hand of another student this century. My research slowed down enough, even if I wouldn't have thought to use dragon blood as Albus did. Is there going to be some kind of test for you to teach me? I didn't want to take another student so early." Flamel sighed, his eyes never leaving her form, "And today was for me to decide if I'd be willing to teach you." He nodded amiably. "But to be a teacher is also to learn from the student, and I cannot waste both of our time with a mediocre girl, no matter how interesting her blood work likely is." Minerva's hold on the hand that carried the mark of the ritual tightened minutely, and the centuries-old man sitting in front of her smiled crookedly. "I know Albus showed you the basics, but something that any alchemist hopeful worth anything cannot teach or be taught is the needed creativity and ingenuity." The witch stared impassively at the oldest man alive while she began reconsidering her choice of learning alchemy from him. Professor Dumbledore had been curiously tight-lipped about the kind of person he was, but now she started to see why. She could see Rubeus act like him if he lived that long, treating other people like useful experiments, giving some breadcrumbs of knowledge to see what unexpected direction they would take. "You're about to complete your last year at Hogwarts, yes?" At her hesitant nod, he hummed thoughtfully before laying out the law, as it were. "First, during this year you'll take up a personal project, something original, something never done before, and present it to me the next summer." Minerva barely held back from smirking smugly. Original projects were all that the Runda was about, it would be hardly impossible to figure out something. "What else?" She raised an eyebrow almost tauntingly, and Flamel was merciless in his answer. "You will not take part in the current conflict." He steepled his fingers while he rested his weight against the back of his armchair. "I won't spend time better devoted to my research on a girl only for her to throw away her life for some nonsensical notion of glory, justice, or whatnot." Minerva's palm smacked lightly against the good of the small table as she rose to her feet. It wasn't that she had been planning to join the war effort, but if it came to that, she would be free to make her choices, like any adult witch in the world. "You cannot possibly." "Why?" His hazel eyes had never seemed so impossibly old. Regimes come and go, and the ICW made a choice that was untenable in the long term, either because of people like Grindelwald or because of the Muggles' ingenuity in devouring every crumb of knowledge available to them in this world of ours. "My studies have the priority." Chapter 73, Harry Potter, Chapter 72, New Edition I. From the window of his recently obtained room, Tom looked out in the night, his eyes focused on the dull red light that came from the makeshift forge Rubeus had built after their return from Greece. The Slytherin prefect would have preferred to sleep, but he felt somewhat uneasy, far from the never-sleeping London, and away from the reassuring quiet of his dormitory at Hogwarts. The sounds of the Forest of Dean were different from anything he had ever had to grow accustomed to. Yes, the branches rustled with the changing wind, and he even fancied he had managed to hear a howl or two during his permanence, but he just wasn't used to it, and it'd take a while to feel comfortable about his new arrangements. Howls that didn't come from a werewolf, that was. Still standing in front of his window, Tom gave a brief glance to the door of his room, after the use of an innocuous levitation charm, meant to test whether the Ministry was truly as incompetent as Hagrid made it out to be. Riddle had of course cursed and warded the entrance to his sleeping place to the best of his ability. He didn't fancy having the werewolf Rubeus was trying to cure surprise him while he was asleep after all. To be frank, being a werewolf, while disgusting, was still a step up from being a muggle. At least Marie could have a minute silver of magic in her life. Tom knew that he would choose it in a heartbeat if their positions were reversed. With a sigh, Riddle turned one last time towards the window that allowed him to see the forge below. It was barely a circular fire pit made of stones, with a charming bellow on one side, an anvil where Hagrid was beating furiously with his wand, a barrel of water, and of course, a cauldron holding a liquid that shone oddly as it reflected the flames. It was just like Rubeus, wasn't it? He had apparently managed to apply the "every potion is a story" drivel to a ritual capable of granting permanent invulnerability from poisons and venoms that were lesser than the Hydra's. With Minerva, he had managed to create a rather resilient trunk with an incredibly secure locking mechanism, which was of course enlarged on the inside to the point that they'd been able to store in it the entirety of the nine-headed snake. They had returned a mere week before, and he was already experimenting with something new. Knowing him, it'd be something mind-numbingly simple in principle, but exasperating when it came to the actual realization. Tom sighed again, and openly surrendered to his curiosity. He dressed quickly and left his room, walking through the house at the light of his lit wand until he managed to exit and reach the back of the building. The encroaching forest had been cut down in a wide radius, stocking necessary wood to warm Marie's home as well as to stop some unwise animals from coming too close. Riddle could almost taste on his tongue the fairly tame wards that hovered above the property. They felt like a folded section of air just out of the corner of his eye, fainter than a whisper, but surely enough to keep muggles and other random animals away. Tom pushed away the small impulse of walking back into the house to kill the beast in its sleep and walked still towards the humongous form of Hagrid. Lit as he was only by the fire of the forge, he somewhat seemed even bigger than usual. He was bare-chested and with short hair matted with sweat that dripped from his brow, his dark eyes glinting like snake scales. Once Riddle passed an invisible boundary, he finally heard the sounds that accompanied his fellow Slytherin's movements. He rose his wand, and the bellow breathed under the fire of the forge, making the flames climb upwards with an eager whooshing whisper, and he lowered it, his muscles rippling with the force of the blow as a metallic clang thundered off the anvil. With his offhand, Rubeus raised a piece of cherry-red iron, eyeing him curiously under the faint moonlight impeded by the clouds and the flickering flashes offered by the lit forge. "Out for a night stroll, Riddle?" With the long pincer he was holding, he placed the piece of iron back into the flames and turned towards Tom, lifting a water skin from his side and taking several deep gulps. Trying to somewhat mask his burning curiosity, Tom chose not to question him directly about the purpose of his actions, and tackled the issue at an angle. Why on earth are you doing this at night? I heard that the right color of the metal can be gauged only in darkness, and the nocturnal breeze helps me cool off. And where would you have heard something like that? Riddle made a show of sniffing the air. Yes, you could use a bath. Of course, I could, his much taller companion retorted. My body spray is tailored for day-to-day use, this kind of effort would have made it ineffective, and I'll have to wash off in any case. Of course, he brewed his own deodorant. Tom held back from rolling his eyes, returning his focus to the forge while keeping distant enough that the heat wouldn't be unbearable on him. How practical of you. We don't have to play this song and dance every time, you know. Rubeus grinned wildly while vaguely gesturing towards Riddle with his wand. You can ask anything regarding what you are interested in, use as I do. Only that it wasn't a wand any longer. On the tip of the length of holly, there was the head of a mallet that seemed to grow out of the wood itself. What? Seeing where his gaze was pointing, Rubeus chuckled. Don't tell me you don't recognize this small transfiguration? Minerva made a note of the spell needed to turn your own wand into something useful for small, day-to-day tasks. And you were so insightful to add a variation that would turn the wand instead into the handle of a whip, while the weapon itself would be able to be used like a living extension of your will to ensnare an opponent. Of course, Riddle remembered, his prodigious mind recalled with perfect clarity the notes from the Runda, and his own choice to add the tame variation of the constraining curse. He had derived it from a rather niche section of dueling transfigurations, usually meant to stall in extremely close quarters, as in competitions only a wand was allowed, and turning the part of your chosen magical tool into a knife took a fraction of the time needed for a conjuration, and was easy to conceal. Of course, the partial conjuration of a whip directly from your wand was a clever application on its own, logically followed by turning the extension of your wand into a cursed rope of some kind, and you thought to turn part of your wand into a mallet, striking with it metal hot enough to set the wood of the wand on fire. The tone was surprisingly tame considering how mind-numbingly stupid that sounded, but unsurprisingly, Rubeus simply laughed it off, rolling his shoulders to work out the kinks caused by the repeated work on the anvil. I'm getting good at working with fire. I've noticed, yes. Tom replied while he walked a bit closer, suddenly spotting the small table that had been covered until that moment by Hagrid's bulk. On it there was a selection of simple daggers that differed one from the other in the dimensions of the blades, as well as the shapes of the handles. It was basically a sequence of butcher knives, scaled for the massive size of Rubeus, and now that Riddle had the time to think about it, it clicked. You're realizing your own set of carving knives, for the Hydra. Disgust welled in his tone as he distractedly cast a cooling charm on himself. You mean to do the rendering by hand? Rubeus simply nodded, as if it was the obvious conclusion. I had prepared myself for a chimera, in particular, to take its blood as it was the most important part, but siphoning off liquids is relatively simple despite the magical resistance of the creature in question. The book I read mentioned that it had to do with the intrinsic nature of blood or venom to flow. His tone changed then, carrying with it a subtle cheer that Riddle found entirely out of line. You probably didn't notice because you were dying, but carving out the heart of the Hydra ruined all the surrounding flesh. Spells to kill work well enough, and a werewolf is naturally inclined to tear through a wizard's magic. It can't oppose even a hippogriff, which is arguably less dangerous. This is what you've been doing all this time. Riddle pushed aside the odd certainty in how Rubeus dictated who would the winner be between a werewolf and a hippogriff, focusing instead on the more pressing issue. But you built the forge only today. Forging with magic is considerably faster than its counterpart. I tried to enchant transfigured knives as a start. Minerva researched how the proper enchantment can pin in place a new shape, remember? With Tom's nod, Rubeus kept talking. But those dulled fairly quickly when working on the Hydra's hide, never mind when it came to working with the muscle groups or the bones. I used the first attempts on a single neck, so I could familiarize myself with its anatomy. I have another 8 necks to go through, but I'd rather perfect my tools on the first one. Riddle remained silent as Hagrid fished the iron out of the forge and placed it one more on the anvil. Now that he managed to give it a good look, he saw that it was already shaped like a blade. His holly wand descended with a metallic clang that rivaled thunder, and Tom grimaced at the incredibly loud noise, his eyes fixed on how Rubeus seemed to be working over the edge of the knife to be. I thought about using the bones of another magical creature to improve this experiment, but the blades needed to carve bone are completely different from what I'd need for the Hydra, so I'm doing an attempt with simple forging for now. Otherwise, tomorrow night I'll forge the tools to forge the tools. The improvised, self-taught smith spoke after several blows, and with a flick of the wrist, he returned his wand to its natural form before pointing it at the edge of the knife. The shimmer was lost on the air, wavering because of the high temperatures, but Tom noticed that Hagrid seemed satisfied by the result. With a decisive movement, he buried the still cherry red metal into the water barrel by his side, and glanced away in order to avoid the cloud of steam that rose as an answer. He seemed to be counting internally, and after 7 seconds, he retreated the metal from the water and plunged it into the cauldron to his left. There was no hissing cloud of steam erupting by the concoction, no flash of light rush of perceivable magic, but Rubeus seemed content with stirring his brew clockwise with the newly quenched piece of iron. Maybe it'd be better if I knew how to forge steel, or if I figured out how to do the same with gold or silver, but they melt at such low temperatures. Chapter 74, Harry Potter, Chapter 73, New Edition 2. There was no hissing cloud of steam erupting by the concoction, no flash of light rush of perceivable magic, but Rubeus seemed content with stirring his brew clockwise with the newly quenched piece of iron. Maybe it'd be better if I knew how to forge steel, or if I figured out how to do the same with gold or silver, but they melt at such low temperatures. While Rubeus rambled, Tom's mind was rushing through his most recent slip. He had mentioned another creature, but what could he be referring to? The potion is meant to reinforce the purpose I tried to forge the blade around, but I won't be able to tell if there are working differences until I try the knives quenched only with water from this one. Hagrid talked almost to himself, only to be interrupted by Riddle. If you're not referring to bones from the Hydra, which is what you're having problems with in the first place. Tom began with understanding gleaming in his eyes and a faint silver of respect appearing on his face as he realized what his tallest companion was talking about. After all, it wasn't like Hagrid had many magical creatures at his disposal to craft his fabled tools. It could only mean that he had carved out everything of use from the Muggle werewolf he had killed during his most disastrous attempt at finding a cure for lycanthropy. Werewolf bones. Hagrid confirmed, but I'm not sure whether using them as the blade itself or only as a handle. They do come from a cursed creature. I don't know if they'd corrupt the Hydra's parts in some way. And maybe you hope to be able to coax the rule of the hunt out of those bones. Riddle nodded, still somewhat disgusted by the topic of rendering a creature by hand, but intrigued by the magic itself. Is the same principle of the ritual, isn't it? Since the body's magical resistance destroyed your conjuration, and assuming that the flesh itself resists ordinary tools, you're trying to ritualistically create something holding a meaning powerful enough to accomplish what you need without corrupting the rendered parts. As Tom had foreseen, it was at once simple and impossibly complex. The detail of werewolf bones, however, reminded him sharply of how mercenary Hagrid could be when push came to shove. He didn't know how his tallest companion had come to know the muggles he was now trying to cure. But Tom knew that any normal person would have been at least briefly saddened by having killed one of the two, and that taking apart its corpse surely wouldn't have appeared even in their wildest nightmares. How quintessentially Slytherin of you, Rubeus. Using my wand as a mallet is fundamental, as I've never hammered iron before. Where did you get the iron? Tom asked idly, still enjoying the admission of the apparently self-taught smith. How carefree can he be with telling me things that any sane person wouldn't even consider, and that any madman would keep close to his chest? I've hopped around a few villages and farms, and took nails, horseshoes. Hagrid shrugged. I've melted everything with a really hot flame and used a transfigured stone stamp to realize the billets. Now I tried to coax the metal around its final purpose, instead of coating the finishing result with the enchantment. Seems like a lot of work for a relatively minor gain. Riddle arched an eyebrow while he was still trying to come to terms with the strange trust that Rubeus had displayed. I had assumed you'd just use spells, or contract a professional for a cut of the gains. We still need a chimera to truly explore what your storing ink can accomplish, don't we? Never mind your idea of building a ship to reach new places to explore. Rubeus argued back. Besides talking with Slughorn, I thought about writing to Ollivander. Maybe he's interested in creating wands that aren't a phoenix feather, dragon heartstring, or unicorn tail hair. I know for sure that on the continent there are wands made with Vila hair. Vila. Humanoid people. Rubeus replied, they're more or less harpies with song capable of ensnaring men, I think. Tom hummed thoughtfully as he walked over the table holding his finished results. You think that selling directly to Ollivander might earn us more? I was thinking of slowly easing my way into learning the basics of wandcraft. Rubeus replied with a sly glance while he finally fished the finished product out of the cauldron. If my experiment with the forge works, it'll confirm my idea about how to craft specific magical items, but a wand, the sheer versatility is something that I can't even begin to grasp. and I observe mine extremely carefully when I cast, yet I have no insight." Riddle heard clearly his vexed companion, and he was forced to let out a chuckle of his own. "It's always knowledge with you, isn't it? In some cases, it's far worthier than any amount of gold, isn't it?" Rubeus replied distractedly, his dark eyes closely examining the last result of his handiwork before setting it down with a satisfied grunt. "We could also talk with Slughorn to sell the parts." The sly glance Rubeus gave Tom clearly implied that he'd be Riddle the one tasked with that particular conversation, as he can probably point towards buyers that won't scam us and won't bring the ministry on our heads, and we'll also need an account at Gringotts for the transactions. Tom's sneer clearly expressed how enthused he was about having to interact with goblins, and his expression turned into an outright glare when Hagrid spoke. "Despise them all you want, but I've yet to see a wizard forge steel like theirs, never mind build such massive underground structures. Won't the carcass spoil by the time you finish with your experiments?" Changing the topic, Tom kept the greater part of his focus on why Hagrid would be so open about the fact that he had carved up a werewolf he used to know. He surely understood just how damning that information could be, and he was far from being as stupid as offering leverage so freely. "Why is he so sure that I won't use this information to have him dance to my tune?" Hagrid's grin flashed like one of his knives in the night. "Minerva and I built that trunk explicitly with the purpose of keeping the result of the hunt inside. Surely you remember that I used 2 different potions to coat the outside and the inside, yes?" Riddle simply hummed as he lit once more his wand, observing with detached curiosity how the metal glinted eagerly as an answer. Cautiously, he extended a hand and kept it above the knives, trusting that sixth sense that stung uncomfortably only to tingle pleasantly as he shifted from a knife to the other. "If you have a spare knife, I might try some enchanting of my own," Riddle offered, still trying to work out the angle at which Rubeus was working. It was always like that when it came to interacting with him. It was clear that they had wanted each other alive for their own reasons, but what did Hagrid gain? "Take the 2 on the left." His tallest companion replied with a nod, as if he had been expecting the offer. And just like that, the picture became complete and it suddenly made a startling amount of sense. Rubeus hadn't risked his own and Minerva's life because of a sense of duty, or common human decency. He had simply decided that he'd gain more on the long term by keeping Tom around and well disposed towards himself. Riddle barely smothered his sudden urge to laugh as he collected the weapons pointed out by Rubeus. Once again, like always when it came to dealing with Hagrid, the principle was simple, while the application escaped anything resembling common sense. It was the same crystal-clear need that had made Hagrid coax Minerva and himself into building the Runda. It was the very same reasoning that held Tom back from organizing an untimely demise for Rubeus. They simply had both too much to gain from each other's continued existence. Tom cast aside that revelation and offered a small smirk of his own to the taller and tired wizard. "It's a pity that the plan of building a pocket only we can access by using the animagus process didn't land anywhere. That's just not how that magic works, as you well know." Rubeus pointed his wand at the forge and killed the fire, only to cover both the cauldron with his brew and the barrel of water with their respective lids that were levitated out of the darkness. "We'll have to rely on enlarging charms then, and maybe some other adaptation of, how did you call it? Storing ink." Riddle took a step back from the table with his own 2 knives while Hagrid packed the finished results of that night's work. "Such a banal name. You can name it as you want, but it's quick and to the point." Rubeus spoke as he started to walk back towards the house. "And keep the werewolf bones art to yourself, okay? Marie really doesn't need to know." "Of course." Riddle enjoyed recognizing how gentlemanly he was being about the abject dehumanizing that was Hagrid's relationship with Paul's carcass. "Would you by chance be willing to craft an enlarged trunk before our return to Hogwarts?" The bargain was clear as day, but his taller companion was already shaking his head. "Enlarging charms are absolutely nightmarish to cast properly. They're on that blurry line between charms that affect a shape and a transfiguration that meddles with a purpose. You'd have more luck with studying Minerva's notes once we're back at the Runda." "How so?" Riddle smothered his flash of annoyance. Hagrid wasn't one to downplay his skills when it came to magic, and so insisting wouldn't have been productive. "The theory, as always when it comes to any charm, isn't impossible to understand. Containers are meant to house objects, and technically, each bag, each trunk, hell, each pocket, is a symbol by itself. Enhancing something to better perform its given task is simple enough. Except that in this case, of course, it isn't." "Of course." Hagrid agreed as he turned fully towards Riddle, the bundle of cloth wrapped around his knives held under an arm while he carefully chose the words to explain at the best of his ability. "The meaning of container is derived from the concept of space. And space is a concept almost as difficult as time to manipulate. Easier because we are beings capable of moving more or less as we wished through space, while time is something that only goes forward. The taller wizard muttered something about his ever-growing list of topics to research only to return to the subject at hand before Tom was forced to remind him of it. From what I understood, well, you know how partial transfigurations aren't incredibly resilient, yes. A partial change in shape weakens the transfiguration as a whole. Extending space inside a container is a method that is weak in the same way. Rubeus explained with a frown on his face. So it's a transfiguration easy to unravel, and while the charm has a good grip, so to speak, the caster's understanding of the concept of space can only go so far, there is no esoteric meaning behind it, and almost zero flexibility in its application, it's difficult to leverage, rigid, brittle. The magical tents work around that issue by using some trick that I've yet to read about, but the idea of standing into an enlarged space with what I know now. The younger wizard made a show of shivering. The concealing charms work well with the extension one, don't they? Tom realized, and then quickly elaborated, after all any object that holds another is like a lie hiding a secret. More like a riddle hiding a truth. Hagrid tilted his head as he grinned unashamedly at the small pun. Minerva's notes will clarify it further, I think. Tom huffed at the horrible wordplay attempted by his taller companion and turned towards the house, entering first while he was starting to think about the revelations of the night. Chapter 75, Harry Potter, Chapter 74, New Edition 3. Phileas Flitwick was a wizard. An incredibly short kid with brown hair that was cut short enough to not require particular care. He had small but piercing brown eyes that shone with wisdom beyond anything one of his age should possess. Because of his obvious goblin ancestry, declared to all sundry by his lightly pointed ears and sharper than normal canines, he hadn't needed to make his first step onto the train to realize that he'd be shunned for his blood. He was prejudged and foredoomed from an early age because of his ancestral connection to a different breed of being that was both regarded and treated as second-class citizens by most of the wizarding community. That wasn't anything he wasn't used to. He knew the stares and the pointed whispers, and he knew that the ignorant would always fear what they could only see as different, instead of new. It was almost understandable in children, but that on itself was merely a reflection of the dismissal inherited by their parents. Yes, in Phileas' opinion, ignorance explained all too well the intense scrutiny he received, coupled with the half-whispered jokes about not letting him see any money, lest he stole it from the hands of his peers. He knew of his circumstances, but wise beyond his years, he had been rightfully sorted into Ravenclaw, and he could only hope that, with time, the House of Rowena would be the first to recognize him fully as one of their own, eventually followed by others. He was rather thick-skinned in any case. Insults and petty words were taken with a weight comparable to the importance of the opinion of strangers, that is to say, they were easily ignored. Even in his enforced loneliness, despite a few tentative smiles and greetings from those that the wizarding culture hadn't managed yet to fully poison, he often found himself secluded in the library, his keen mind eagerly consuming everything that caught his fancy. From the clearly biased history texts that allowed him insight into the culture that so readily shunned him, to the odd legend born from even odder magical creatures, to what he instinctively understood as his true calling, charms. Truly, it was obvious how they were a pinnacle sustaining the entirety of wizard kind, it was blatant how much they were part of your day-to-day life, and there was something in their singular simplicity that could grow into overwhelming complexity that spoke to him at a level nothing else could. Besides the more practical effects, such as reducing the time he needed to ready himself each morning, or simplifying his study routine once he managed to enchant a quill to properly write what he spoke, each of those spells held an elegance unmatched. Enjoying charms, are we? A rumbling deep voice made Phileas raise his head from the book he was submerged in order to glance to the newcomer that he hadn't spotted the approach of. He almost fell out of his chair as he barely managed to not squeak in fright. The Slytherin student, as he had an undone silver and green tie hanging over his neck, was massive in a way that the term massive didn't manage to cover. Standing easy at more than 3 meters of height, with unruly short hair and a rather large build that matched perfectly his height, the wizard was regarding him with a wide smile on his face, and dark eyes that were far too eager for his approach to not be something he had planned in advance. Steeling himself for what was likely going to be the first instance of a more physical kind of bully since his arrival at Hogwarts, Phileas was shocked in a wholly different manner when the giant in all but name turned his attention to the book the Ravenclaw student had been perusing. "Ah, I tried that one. Farsi is competent for sure, but he isn't the most flexible of thinkers, and this particular author wouldn't recognize an original thought if it bit him in the arse." The diminutive wizard found himself sniffing with some sort of outrage. He could deal with insult to himself just fine, but a wholly different thing was to label a book for him before he had finished reading it. Never mind the barely held back disdain for Professor Farsi. I don't believe I know you. Phileas spoke with his squeaky voice, but his stern expression only managed to amuse the older wizard. Odd, isn't it? That the smallest wizard wouldn't have taken notice of the one that is almost 3 meters and half tall. The smile on the stranger's face widened with what could only be described as pride. Maybe I should have waited a bit more to approach you. A month is hardly enough time for a first year to appreciate the nuances of a subject, even if it is his favorite one. Phileas narrowed his keen gaze upon the too tall Slytherin, and he was truly shocked that, in fact, he couldn't recall spotting him in the Great Hall, where he'd have towered upon all of his housemates. And how would you know about which subject is my favorite, oh Slytherin stranger? The newcomer casually enlarged a chair and sat beside the diminutive wizard while he let out a low chuckle. Oh, where did I hear this before? Rubeus Hagrid. Phileas found himself shaking the otherworldly massive hand of the imposing stranger while he kept talking. It's been some years since I last saw someone with eyes like yours. I'm Phileas Flitwick. He found himself answering while he started to think that maybe the student wasn't there to bully the little Ravenclaw. What do you mean by eyes like mine? And yes, how come I didn't notice you before? A bounded stack of parchment was quietly placed over the book the first year had been studying, and a quick glance revealed the handmade notes to have a nasty script on the first page that proudly declared, Shadows and Secrets, by Rubeus Hagrid. I'm not going to publish this, but I think it's a better starting point to properly manage variations of the Notice Me Not. The deep voice of the older student spoke with an amused tilt, and by eyes like yours, of course, I meant eyes like mine, even if I think you're a little too prone to follow the rules. I don't follow. Phileas found himself answering while his hands were already opening the small stack of well-organized notes. Immediately he noticed that while sparse, the script was dense with meaning, and he hadn't even reached half of the second paragraph when he caught an obscure reference to the 3 pillars of existence. Why are you giving me this? Well, during my first month, I hopped a couple of times in the restricted section. Hagrid grinned mischievously, and that I'd offer you both the key to the knowledge of how I managed to move without being pointed at and annoyed by the majority of the school's populace. When it could technically be also used to sneak a peek, so to speak, is entirely a coincidence. Phileas found himself pursing his lips while he focused on the sequence of events like they were pieces of a puzzle, and still holding on to the gift from Rubeus, he found himself asking what in hindsight was obvious, is this some sort of test from Slytherin House? The 2 big students snorted loudly as an answer, Morgana's tits, no, of course not, most of my house is exactly like all others. And after a beat, Hagrid grinned crookedly. They're average, almost painfully so, I'd never considered inviting them. Inviting them to, what? The squeaky voice of Phileas asked once more while he placed the gift he had just received on the wooden surface where he had been peacefully studying before that 2 big student decided to interrupt him. Rubeus merely tapped the side of his nose. That'd be telling, for now, simply take this in the spirit in which it was given. Knowledge, for a seeker of knowledge. The Ravenclaw student found himself glancing towards the bound stack of notes once more, his eyes scanning ahead while he started to make himself an idea of what exactly he was dealing with. I won't use this to sneak into the restricted section only for you to have a laugh. We are all entitled to our choices. Hagrid nodded agreeably, but it's odd, isn't it? A place of learning where some learning is forbidden. Those books are restricted, not forbidden. Only because nobody knows what you might actually find in there. The 2 tall students simply rose a challenging eyebrow, but I have one last thing to say before I go. Change is neither good, nor bad, but knowledge is always useful. You won't become a raging monster only because you learn how to be one. The 2 tall wizard rose from his seat and returned it to its original size with a neglectful tap of his wand. Would you be willing to answer a question? With wit striking suddenly, Phileas found himself answering, it seems I just did. Surprisingly, instead of showing annoyance, Rubeus simply nodded approvingly, and then asked, why do you enjoy charms? Somewhat surprised by the question, the Ravenclaw found himself answering, they are, at their core, the direct exercise of will upon reality. And at the unimpressed expression on the older wizard's face, Phileas rolled his eyes while he crossed his arms despondently. Oh, sure, any piece of magic could be defined like that, but charms are direct in their effects. While the mentality needed for them is a bit more complex, their purpose is perfectly matched to what you need from them in each situation. Proven you're knowledgeable enough. The 2 tall Slytherin replied with another nod as he began to walk away, his long legs quickly bringing him away from the much smaller student. Left alone, Phileas found himself eyeing again the bounded stack of notes, and felt the beginning of a faint headache thrum at the base of his skull. Why was it that the more he looked at that dark ink, the more he thought that the gift was a fisher's hook?
Thanks for listening.